5 children witnessed a murder. The killer wants them dead. One broken man must decide, turn away, or lose everything to save them. This is the story of a Christmas Eve that shattered silence, when innocence fled through frozen darkness and found shelter in the last place anyone expected. A story where power meets protection, where a town must choose between comfort and conscience, and where 5 desperate souls transform a dead man's heart back to life. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. Because what happens next will break you and rebuild you all at once. The wind that Christmas Eve carried more than snow. It carried the sound of dying. Caleb Hart heard it first as a whisper, a flutter against the barn wall that didn't match the rhythm of the storm. He stood at his kitchen window, coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at the structure he'd built with his own father 30 years prior. The wood was weathered now, gray as his beard, sagging in places where time had pressed too hard. Much like himself. He was 53 years old and had been alone for 7 of them. 7 years since the fever took Mary. 7 years since little Samuel stopped breathing in the night, his small body surrendering to the same sickness that had already claimed his mother. Caleb had buried them both on the hill behind the house, under the cottonwood where he'd proposed 26 years earlier. He hadn't spoken their names aloud since. The sound came again, sharper this time, almost like a cough, but thinner, more desperate. Caleb set down his cup. His hand moved by instinct to the rifle mounted above the door, a Henry repeater that had seen him through 3 hard winters and more than one encounter with wolves. Wyoming Territory in 1885 wasn't kind to the careless. The land respected only 2 things, strength and preparation. He pulled on his coat, lit a lantern, and stepped into the cold. The snow was coming down sideways, driven by a wind that seemed to have teeth. It bit through his layers and found the old wound in his left shoulder, a reminder of a different kind of violence, a different kind of night. He kept his head down and pushed toward the barn, his boots crunching through snow already 6 inches deep and rising. The barn door hung slightly ajar. Caleb knew he'd latched it. He always latched it. His mare, Duchess, was inside, along with 3 chickens too stubborn to freeze. Leaving it open was an invitation to predators, and out here, predators came in many forms. He shouldered the door wider and raised the lantern. "Don't shoot." The voice was small, young, male. Caleb froze, rifle halfway to his shoulder. The lantern light spilled across the barn's interior, illuminating hay bales, empty stalls, and there, in the far corner, pressed against the back wall as if they could disappear into the wood itself. Children. 5 of them. Caleb's breath caught. He lowered the rifle slightly but kept it ready. His eyes adjusted, taking in details that made his chest tighten. The oldest was a boy, maybe 13, standing in front of the others like a human shield. His face was thin, cheekbones too prominent, lips cracked and bleeding. His coat, if you could call it that, was more holes than fabric. Behind him huddled 3 more, 2 girls and another boy, all younger, all wearing the same expression of exhausted terror. And in the oldest boy's arms, wrapped in what looked like a woman's shawl, was a baby. It wasn't moving. "Please," the boy said. His voice cracked, whether from cold or emotion, Caleb couldn't tell. "Please don't send us back." Caleb stared. He'd lived alone for so long that the sound of another human voice felt almost foreign in this space. His barn, his sanctuary of silence, and now it was full of children, starving, freezing children who looked at him like he was either salvation or the end. "Who are you?" Caleb's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Where did you come from?" The boy swallowed hard. "My name is Evan Reed. These are my sisters and brother, Clara, Lila, and Thomas. And this—" His arms tightened around the bundle. "This is Anna. She's 6 months old. Where are your parents?" Something dark crossed Evan's face. "Dead." The word hung in the frozen air between them. Caleb saw the way the other children flinched at it, the way the middle girl, Clara, he thought, pressed her face against Evan's back and began to cry silently, her small shoulders shaking. "How long have you been in my barn?" "Since yesterday morning. We walked through the night before that. I didn't know where else to go. I saw your chimney smoke from the ridge and thought maybe—" Evan's voice failed him. "Maybe you'd have food." Caleb looked at them again, really looked. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken. The youngest boy, Thomas, couldn't have been more than 7, and he was leaning heavily against his sister, as if standing required more strength than he possessed. The baby in Evan's arms hadn't stirred once. "That child," Caleb said quietly. "Is she alive?" Evan's face crumpled. "Barely. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. We ran out of milk and I tried to give her water, but she won't take it anymore. She's just sleeping now, all the time." Something old and buried shifted in Caleb's chest. A memory of another baby, another set of blue lips, another moment when he'd stood helpless while life slipped away. He lowered the rifle completely. "Come with me," he said. "Into the house." Evan didn't move. You're not going to turn us in?" "To who?" "To her." The way he said it, her, carried a weight that made Caleb pause. There was fear in that single syllable. Real, bone-deep fear. "I don't know who you're talking about," Caleb said, "but right now that baby is dying, and if we don't get her warm and fed in the next hour, talking about anything else won't matter. Now move." Evan hesitated one more moment, then nodded. He turned to the others. "It's okay," he whispered. "Come on." They moved as a unit, the 3 older children supporting Thomas between them, Evan cradling the baby with a gentleness that spoke of practice, of necessity, of love that had become survival. They followed Caleb across the yard, heads bent against the wind, small figures swallowed by the storm. Inside the house, Caleb moved with purpose. He'd lived alone long enough that efficiency had replaced comfort, everything in its place, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. But the stove was hot, and there was soup left from dinner, and he had blankets stored in the chest by the stairs. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the chairs around his small table. The children obeyed instantly, too tired or too scared to do otherwise. They sank into the seats like stones dropping into water, and Caleb saw the way their bodies seemed to give up the moment they stopped moving, as if the act of sitting released some terrible tension that had been holding them together. He moved to the stove and ladled soup into bowls, potato and venison, thick and still warm. He set them down in front of the children and watched as 4 pairs of eyes fixated on the food with an intensity that made his throat tight. "Eat," he said. Slowly. They didn't need to be told twice. Clara and Lila fell on their bowls like animals, scooping soup with their hands before remembering the spoons. Thomas was slower, more methodical, but Caleb could see the tremor in the boy's hands as he lifted each spoonful to his mouth. Evan didn't touch his bowl. His attention was entirely on the baby in his arms. Caleb crouched down in front of him. "Let me see her." Evan's arms tightened instinctively, but then he forced himself to relax. He pulled back the shawl, revealing a tiny face so pale it was almost translucent. The baby's lips were blue, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her eyes didn't open. "How long has she been like this?" "Since this morning. She was crying yesterday, but today—" Evan's voice broke. "Today, she just stopped." Caleb had seen this before. Starvation in infants moved fast. The body began to shut down, conserving energy, pulling inward. If they didn't act now, the baby wouldn't see sunrise. "I need warm water and honey," Caleb said, standing. "And cloth, clean cloth." He moved through his house with the efficiency of a man who'd once been a father, who remembered the rituals of caring for something small and helpless. He boiled water, cooled it to blood temperature, mixed in honey and a pinch of salt. He tore a clean shirt into strips and soaked them in the mixture. "Hold her head up," he told Evan, returning to the table. The boy obeyed, his hands shaking. Caleb pressed the soaked cloth to the baby's lips, squeezing gently so that drops of the sweetened water ran into her mouth. Nothing happened. He tried again, and again. The other children had stopped eating, watching with held breath as Caleb worked. On the 4th attempt, the baby's throat moved. A swallow. Small, but there. "Come on," Caleb murmured. "Come on, little one." Another swallow, then another. The baby's eyelids fluttered, and a small sound emerged from her throat. Not quite a cry, but close. It was the most beautiful sound Caleb had heard in 7 years. "She's drinking," Clara whispered, her voice filled with desperate hope. "She's drinking!" Caleb continued the process, patient and steady, until the baby had taken perhaps 2 tablespoons of the mixture. Her color began to improve, the blue fading from her lips. Her eyes opened, gray and unfocused, but open. Evan was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as he held his sister. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you." Caleb said nothing. He wrapped the baby in a warm blanket and placed her in a basket by the stove, close enough to the heat but not dangerously so. She made another small sound and then drifted back to sleep. A different kind of sleep now, deeper and more natural. He turned back to the table. The children had finished their soup and were staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but also confusion, as if kindness was something foreign and suspect. "There's more," Caleb said, gesturing to the pot. "Eat until you're full, then we'll talk." They ate 3 more bowls each before their bodies began to accept that food was real, that it wasn't going to be taken away. Caleb made tea and set out bread and butter. The children devoured it all, and he let them, knowing that their stomachs would protest later, but understanding that right now they needed to feel full more than they needed to feel comfortable. When they finally slowed, when the frantic edge had left their eating, Caleb pulled a chair from the corner and sat down across from them. "Now," he said quietly, "tell me who you're running from." The children exchanged glances. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret Crowell." The name meant nothing to Caleb. "Who's that?" "She owns the land north of here," Evan said. His hands were clenched on the table, knuckles white. "Almost all of it. 15,000 acres. She has men and money, and she has the law." "What do you mean she has the law?" "The judge in town, the deputies, the marshal, they all work for her." Evan's voice was flat now, reciting facts. "If you cross her, you lose. Your land, your livelihood, sometimes your life. Everyone knows it. No one talks about it." Caleb leaned back. "And you crossed her." "Our father did." This came from Lila, the youngest girl. She was maybe 9, with dark hair and eyes too old for her face. "He wouldn't sell his water rights." "Water rights?" Evan nodded. "We had a ranch. Small, just 40 acres, but it sat on the best water source in the valley. A spring that never ran dry, even in drought years. Crowell wanted it. She offered to buy it 3 times, and Dad said no every time. He said it was ours, that his father had claimed it fair, and that no amount of money would make him sell our family's legacy to someone who'd just use it to choke out everyone else." "Smart man," Caleb said. "A dead man." Evan's voice went hard. 2 weeks ago, Crowell came to our house with her foreman, a man named Dutch Keller. He has a scar across his face, from his eye to his chin. You can't miss him. They said Dad had one more chance to sell, and he said no again, so Dutch pulled a gun and shot him. The room went silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "We were in the house," Clara whispered. "We heard it, the gunshot. We ran outside, and Dad was on the ground, and there was blood everywhere, and Crowell was standing over him telling Dutch to make sure he was dead. She saw you." "She saw Evan," Lila said. "He ran out first." Dutch started to pull his gun again, but Crowell stopped him. She said killing children would raise questions they didn't need. She said it would be cleaner if we just disappeared. Caleb felt cold spread through his chest. "Disappeared?" Evan's jaw tightened. "She took us. Said she was our legal guardian now, that the ranch was hers, that we were orphans, and she was doing the Christian thing by taking us in. She locked us in a room at her estate and told us we'd be well cared for, but that we could never leave. And if we ever told anyone what we saw, Dutch would finish what he started." "We were there for 9 days, Clara said. Her voice was shaking. 9 days in that room. She brought food, but she also brought papers, legal papers. She said we had to sign over the water rights, that it was just a formality since she was our guardian now. Evan refused. So she stopped bringing food," Evan finished, "for 3 days. No food, no water. She said we'd sign eventually, that hunger makes everyone reasonable. But I knew if we signed, we'd never walk out of that room alive. We were witnesses. We knew what she did. The only reason we were still breathing was because she needed those papers signed by the legal heirs. How did you escape? A ghost of a smile crossed Evan's face. Thomas, he's small, smaller than he should be for his age. There was a window in the room, high up and barred, but the bars were old. Thomas climbed up and worked one loose over 2 nights while we tried to keep quiet. When it finally came free, he squeezed through and opened the door from the outside. Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time. His voice was thin and high. I was scared. It was dark, and I didn't know where I was. But Evan said I had to be brave. So I was brave. You were more than brave, Caleb said gently. You saved your family. The boy's face crumpled, and he started to cry, deep shaking sobs that spoke of terror held in for too long. Clara pulled him close, rocking him gently while her own tears fell. We ran, Evan continued, his voice mechanical now, as if emotion was too dangerous. It was the middle of the night, and we just ran. We took Anna and whatever we could carry, and we ran. I knew Crowell would send men after us, so we stayed off the roads. We walked through the forest, through the creek beds, anywhere we thought they couldn't track us easily. It took us 5 days to get here. We ate roots and drank from streams, and Anna got sicker every day because we couldn't feed her properly. Why didn't you go to the law, to the marshal? The look Evan gave him was ancient. I told you, she is the law. There's nowhere to go, nowhere that's safe. We thought maybe if we got far enough away, maybe across the border into Montana, we'd find someone who could help. But Anna got so sick, and we were so hungry, and then we saw your smoke, and I thought, his voice broke. I thought maybe just one night of warmth and safety before we had to keep running. Caleb looked at the 5 children sitting at his table, exhausted, traumatized, hunted. He thought about turning them away, about the wisdom of staying out of other people's problems. He thought about the life he'd built in silence and solitude, the careful distance he'd maintained from everyone and everything since Mary and Samuel died. He thought about Anna and her basket, those tiny fingers curling and uncurling as she slept. And he thought about what it meant to be a man, not in the abstract, but in the specific, in the moment when choice becomes action and action becomes consequence. You'll stay here, he said. Evan stared at him. What? You'll stay here, all of you, until we figure out what to do next. You don't understand, Evan said urgently. Crowell will come. She has men everywhere. She'll find us, and when she does, she'll have to go through me. The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. Caleb hadn't planned to say them. They came from somewhere deeper than thought, from a place in him that he'd thought was dead. You can't, Clara whispered. She'll destroy you. She destroys everyone. Maybe. Caleb stood and began clearing the table. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you're going to sleep in beds with full bellies and warm blankets. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest. He showed them upstairs to the rooms that hadn't been used in 7 years. His bedroom and Samuel's room, both preserved exactly as they'd been the day they died. He stripped Samuel's bed of its old linens and replaced them with fresh ones from the chest, trying not to think about the last child who'd slept here. The girls would share Samuel's bed. The boys would take Mary's room. The baby would sleep in the basket by the stove where Caleb could monitor her through the night. As he tucked them in, an action that felt both foreign and achingly familiar, Clara reached out and grabbed his hand. Why? She asked. Why are you helping us? You don't know us. Caleb looked down at her small face, at the fear and hope warring in her eyes. He thought about all the answers he could give. About duty. About decency. About what was right. Instead, he told her the truth. Because no child should die for being witness to murder, he said quietly, and because I'm tired of living in a world where men like me do nothing while men like Crowell do everything. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. Downstairs, Caleb sat by the stove and watched Anna sleep. Her breathing was stronger now, more regular. In the morning, he'd need to find milk, proper food for an infant. He'd need to make plans, to think through what was coming, because something was coming. That was certain. He'd just made himself an enemy of the most powerful person in the territory, and he'd done it without hesitation, without calculation, without anything resembling a plan. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind howled like something alive. But inside, 5 children slept in safety for the first time in weeks. And Caleb Hart, who had been alone for 7 years, who had built walls around his heart higher than his barn, who had promised himself never to feel again the pain of losing what he loved. Caleb Hart sat watch in the darkness and knew that everything had changed. The night that shouldn't have happened had happened anyway, and there was no going back. When dawn broke on Christmas morning, Caleb woke to the sound of a baby crying, a healthy, hungry, angry cry that filled his house with life. He fed Anna carefully, mixing milk from Duchess with warm water and honey, and watched as she drank with the enthusiasm of the living. The other children came downstairs one by one, cautious, as if they still couldn't quite believe the previous night was real. Caleb made breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast with jam, and watched them eat with less desperation than before, but no less thoroughness. "What happens now?" Evan asked when the meal was finished. Caleb had been thinking about that question all night. The smart play was to take them to the marshal in town, to make an official report, to trust in the system. But if what the children said was true, if Crowell truly owned the law, then that was suicide. "Now," Caleb said slowly, "we get our story straight, and then we go to town. Together." "That's insane," Evan said flatly. She'll do what she was always going to do. The difference is she'll have to do it in public, in front of witnesses. Right now you're ghosts, disappeared children nobody's looking for. But if we walk into town together, if we make noise, if we tell your story to enough people fast enough, you become real. You become a problem that can't be solved with a bullet in the dark." Clara bit her lip. "What if people don't believe us?" "Then we make them believe. We go to the newspaper, the church, the telegraph office. We tell your story everywhere until ignoring it becomes impossible." It was a gamble, and Caleb knew it. But it was the only move they had. Hiding only worked until you were found. Running only worked until you were caught. The only weapon they had was truth, and the only armor was sunlight. "Get dressed," Caleb said. "Wear whatever's warmest. We leave in an hour." The ride into town took 3 hours through snow that had deepened overnight. Caleb drove his wagon with Anna bundled against his chest, and the 4 older children huddled in the back under blankets. Every mile he expected to see riders coming. Every tree line could hide an ambush. But they arrived unopposed. The town of White River was small, maybe 300 souls, a single main street lined with businesses that catered to ranchers and miners. The church stood at the north end, the saloon at the south. In between was everything else: the general store, the telegraph office, the marshal's station, the hotel, and the newspaper. Caleb stopped the wagon outside the White River Gazette and helped the children down. Through the window he could see a man bent over a printing press, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hair standing in wild gray tufts. "Stay close," Caleb said, and pushed open the door. The man looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity as he registered Caleb and the 5 children. "Can I help you?" "My name is Caleb Hart. I need you to print a story." The man, the editor, Caleb assumed, straightened. "What kind of story?" "The kind that's going to change everything." And there, in a cramped newspaper office that smelled of ink and paper, with snow falling outside and danger gathering in the shadows, Evan Reed began to speak. He told the story of his father's murder. He told the story of their imprisonment. He told the story of their escape and the 2 weeks of terror that followed. The editor listened, his expression grave, his pencil moving rapidly across paper. When Evan finished, the man set down his pencil and looked at Caleb. "You know what you're doing?" he asked quietly. "Accusing Margaret Crowell? She'll come for you. She'll come for all of you." "Let her come," Caleb said, "but let her do it in the light." The editor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll have this ready by tomorrow morning. Front page. Every word." "Make it today," Caleb said. "We might not have until tomorrow." Something in his tone made the editor nod again. "Today, then. Give me 6 hours." They left the newspaper and went to the church. The minister, a thin man with kind eyes named Reverend Michaels, listened to their story with growing horror. When they finished, he promised sanctuary, promised to spread word through the congregation, promised to stand with them when the reckoning came. They went to the telegraph office next. Caleb sent messages to the territorial governor, to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, to anyone with authority beyond Crowell's reach. He didn't know if they'd help, but he was laying groundwork, creating a trail too wide to erase. By afternoon, word was spreading. People came to the church to see the children, to hear the story firsthand. Some believed immediately. Others were skeptical. But they were listening, and that was enough. Caleb felt the tension building with each passing hour. Every rider that passed made his hand move toward his rifle. Every loud sound made the children flinch. They were exposed now, visible, vulnerable, but they were also real. At sunset, as Caleb prepared to move the children to the boarding house where they could sleep, the door to the church opened. A woman stood in the doorway. She was perhaps 60, tall and straight-backed, dressed in expensive black wool. Her hair was silver and pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful once, but had hardened into something more like granite. Her eyes were pale blue and cold. Behind her stood 6 men. They were hard-looking, the kind who wore guns comfortably. One of them had a scar running from his eye to his chin. Margaret Crowell had come. "Caleb Hart," she said, her voice cultured and utterly certain. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between the children and the doorway. "These children don't belong to anyone. They're free citizens with rights. They're orphaned minors under my legal guardianship." Crowell pulled papers from her coat and held them up. "As you can see, everything is in order. Now, I'll ask politely one time, surrender them." "No." The word echoed in the church. Behind Caleb, he heard the children breathing, fast and shallow. Reverend Michaels stepped forward, his voice shaking but firm. "Mrs. Crowell, these children have made serious accusations. Surely you'd want—" "I want what's legally mine, Reverend." Crowell's voice never changed tone. "These children are confused, traumatized by their father's tragic accident. They need proper care, proper supervision, not wild stories encouraged by strangers with savior complexes." "Their father was murdered," Caleb said flatly. "They watched it happen. They can describe it in detail. Children imagine things, especially when coached." Crowell's gaze shifted to Evan, and Caleb saw the boy flinch. "I've been nothing but kind to them, and this is how they repay me, with lies and drama?" "Let's put it to the law then," Caleb said. "Let's have an investigation. Let's hear their testimony in court." Crowell smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "The law, Mr. Hart, is precisely what I've brought with me." One of the men stepped forward, deputy's badge glinting on his chest. "I'm Deputy Warren. Mrs. Crowell's guardianship papers are in order. You're harboring minors illegally. Release them now, or you'll be arrested." Caleb didn't move. Around the church, the townspeople who had gathered began to murmur. Some looked frightened. Others looked angry. But no one moved to help. "You'll have to arrest me then," Caleb said quietly. Dutch Keller, the scarred man, rested his hand on his gun. "That can be arranged." The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Caleb could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the children pressing against his back, could sense the moment tilting toward violence. And then a voice cut through the silence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The editor of the White River Gazette stood in the doorway, holding a stack of newspapers. Behind him were more townspeople, drawn by the confrontation. "I've just printed tomorrow's edition," the editor said, his voice carrying. "It contains every detail of these children's story, every accusation, every name. If anything happens to them tonight, the entire territory will know by morning, and they'll know who to blame." Crowell's face didn't change, but Caleb saw her jaw tighten. "Printing lies is libel, Mr. Barnes." "Then sue me. But first, let's have that investigation Mr. Hart suggested. Let's hear the children's testimony. Let's examine your guardianship papers. Let's look into the death of Samuel Reed. Let's do everything properly and legally." Barnes stepped forward, newspapers still in his hands. "Unless you have some objection to the truth being told." The silence stretched again. Caleb could see Crowell calculating, weighing options, measuring risk. Finally, she folded the papers and tucked them back into her coat. "This isn't over," she said, her voice like frost. Not by a long measure. She turned and walked out, her men following. Dutch Keller was the last to leave, and as he passed, he looked directly at Caleb and smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew how stories ended. When they were gone, Caleb's legs nearly gave out. He caught himself on a pew and felt Evan's hand on his shoulder. "You saved us," the boy whispered. "Again." "No," Caleb said, looking around at the townspeople who had gathered, who had witnessed, who had, at least in this moment, chosen to stand. "We saved each other." But as night fell, and Caleb settled the children into rooms at the boarding house, as he posted himself in the hallway with his rifle across his knees, he knew the truth. This wasn't victory. This was merely the opening move. The real battle was still coming. And Margaret Crowell never lost. The boarding house creaked through the night like a ship at sea. Caleb sat in the narrow hallway between the children's rooms, his rifle across his lap, listening to every sound. The wind rattled windows. Floorboards settled. Somewhere downstairs, the proprietor, Mrs. Chen, moved about preparing breakfast for the morning guests. Normal sounds, innocent sounds. But Caleb's nerves were drawn so tight that each one felt like a threat. Inside the rooms, the children slept fitfully. He could hear them through the thin walls, Thomas whimpering in his sleep, Clara murmuring reassurances, Evan's restless pacing before he finally settled. Only Anna seemed at peace, her breathing soft and steady in the basket beside Caleb's chair. He'd checked the locks 3 times, the windows twice. He'd marked the exits and measured the distances. 7 years of solitude had dulled his tactical instincts, but they hadn't erased them. The war had taught him things that didn't fade, no matter how much time passed or how hard you tried to forget. At dawn, Mrs. Chen brought him coffee and a knowing look. She was a widow herself, Chinese by birth, who'd come west with her husband during the railroad boom and stayed when he died in a tunnel collapse. She ran the cleanest boarding house in White River and asked fewer questions than most. "You look like hell, Mr. Hart," she said, setting the cup in his hands. "When's the last time you slept?" "I'll sleep when this is over." "And when will that be?" Caleb took a long drink of the bitter coffee. "I don't know." She nodded as if that was the answer she'd expected. "The children need feeding. I'll bring something up. You need to eat too, whether you think so or not." Mrs. Chen, "No charge," she said, cutting him off. "Not for this. What that woman did—" She shook her head, her mouth tight. "Some things are worth standing against, even when it costs you." After she left, Caleb sat with those words. Worth standing against, even when it costs you. The cost was already mounting. His farm stood empty, vulnerable. His livestock needed tending. His fields needed work. Every hour he spent here was an hour his life back home fell further into neglect. But when he thought about leaving, about walking away, he saw Clara's face as she'd asked him why. "Why are you helping us?" The answer hadn't changed with daylight. If anything, it had grown stronger. By mid-morning, the boarding house had become an unlikely fortress. Reverend Michaels arrived first, bringing news that his sermon the previous day had stirred the congregation. Some families had offered homes for the children, places to hide them separately where Crowell's men might not think to look. Caleb rejected the idea immediately. "We stay together," he said firmly. "They get separated. They get picked off one by one. At least here, there are witnesses. There are people watching." Barnes, the newspaper editor, came next with copies of the morning edition. The headline read, "Local children allege murder, imprisonment." Below it, Evan's testimony filled 3 columns in stark, unflinching detail. Names, dates, locations, everything laid bare. "It's all over town," Barnes said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Sold every copy by 8 o'clock and printed 100 more. People are talking. Some are angry at you for stirring up trouble, but others—" He paused. "Others are starting to remember things. Questions they didn't ask. Disappearances that seemed too convenient. Your boy's testimony is opening doors people kept locked for a long time." Evan, standing behind Caleb, spoke quietly. "Will it be enough?" Barnes's expression sobered. "Honestly, I don't know. Crowell's had this territory in her pocket for 15 years. She's got money, influence, and enough dirt on enough people to keep them in line. But light is a funny thing. Once you shine it in the dark corners, you can't unsee what's there. The morning brought others too. Ranchers who'd lost land to Crowell's expansion. Merchants who'd been forced to sell at her prices. A widow whose husband had died in what was ruled an accident but which she swore was murder. They came one by one, drawn by the newspaper article, and they told their stories in hushed voices as if the walls themselves might report back to Crowell. "She bought my note from the bank," one farmer said, his weathered hands twisting his hat, "then called it due 2 months early. When I couldn't pay, she took my land and gave me a job working the same fields I used to own, for wages that barely feed my family. My son spoke against her in a town meeting," another woman added. 3 days later, he was beaten so badly he can't work anymore. No one saw who did it. The marshal said it was probably drifters passing through. Each story added weight to what Caleb already knew. They weren't fighting one woman. They were fighting a system, carefully constructed over years, that bent everything to her will. The law, the economy, even the social fabric of the town, all of it threaded through with her influence. By noon, Deputy Warren appeared at the boarding house door. He looked uncomfortable, his badge catching the winter light as he removed his hat. "Mr. Hart, I need to speak with you." Caleb stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "If you're here to arrest me, I'm here to warn you." Warren's voice was low, urgent. "Whatever you think you're doing, it needs to stop. Today. Now. Those children witnessed a murder. They were held prisoner. I'm not stopping anything." Warren glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "You don't understand how this works. Crowell doesn't just own land, she owns people. The judge who'd hear any case against her, she holds his mortgage. The bank president? Her cousin. The territorial representative? She funded his campaign. You can't win this." "Maybe not, but I can try." "Trying will get you killed." Warren stepped closer, and Caleb saw genuine fear in his eyes. "I've seen what happens to people who oppose her. Good people, smart people. They end up ruined or dead or wishing they were. Last year, a rancher tried to organize resistance. He accidentally fell down a well and drowned. His wife found him 3 days later. The marshal ruled it accidental, but everyone knew. And you went along with it." Warren's face flushed. "I have a family, 2 daughters, a wife. You think I like wearing this badge knowing what it means? But I also like having a roof over my head and food on the table, and that's what I lose if I cross her. So you're asking me to sacrifice these children to protect your comfort. I'm asking you to be realistic. You're one man. She's an empire. The math doesn't work in your favor." Caleb studied the deputy. The fear, the shame, the desperate rationalization. He'd seen it before, in the war. Men who knew what was right but lacked the courage to act on it, who watched atrocities happen and told themselves they were being practical. "Maybe the math doesn't work," Caleb said quietly. "But I'm doing it anyway. Now, are you here to arrest me or just to beg me to make your cowardice easier to live with?" Warren's hand moved to his gun, then stopped. He stood there, trembling with anger or shame or both, then turned and walked away without another word. Inside, Evan had been watching through the window. "He's right, you know. We can't win." "Probably not," Caleb agreed. "But we can make her work for it. We can make it expensive. We can make enough noise that even if she wins, the victory is poisoned." That afternoon brought the first real assault, not with guns, but with law. A different deputy, not Warren, but a harder man named Pike, arrived with papers. He nailed them to the boarding house door while a small crowd gathered. "By order of Judge Whitmore," Pike announced, his voice carrying, "Caleb Hart is hereby ordered to surrender custody of the Reed children to their legal guardian, Margaret Crowell, by sunset today. Failure to comply will result in arrest and charges of kidnapping." "On what grounds?" Barnes called from the crowd, his notebook already out. "On the grounds that Mrs. Crowell has legal guardianship papers, properly filed and witnessed, designating her as the sole guardian of the minors in question." Pike's voice was bored, mechanical. "Mr. Hart has no legal standing. His refusal to comply constitutes criminal interference." Reverend Michaels pushed forward. "What about the children's testimony? What about the allegations of murder?" "The marshal has investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The death of Samuel Reed was ruled accidental. He was cleaning his rifle when it discharged. Tragic, but not criminal." "That's a lie." Evan's voice rang out from the boarding house window. The crowd turned, and Caleb saw faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all uncertain. Dutch Keller shot my father in cold blood while Crowell watched. I saw it. We all saw it. Pike looked up at the window, his expression unchanged. The word of traumatized children against established records and witness testimony. The judge has made his ruling. Sunset, Mr. Hart. After that, you're a criminal. He walked away, and the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Caleb pulled the notice off the door and read it carefully. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear: surrender or be destroyed. What do we do? Clara asked. She'd come down the stairs silently, her face pale. Caleb looked at the paper, then at her, then at the other children gathering around. Thomas held Anna now, rocking her gently. Lila gripped Evan's hand. They were looking at him like he had answers, like he was something more than a broken farmer who'd stumbled into their lives by accident. We fight, he said simply. We go to that judge and we demand a real hearing. We make them look at you, listen to you, see you as human beings instead of property to be transferred. And if they won't? Then we make them arrest me in front of the whole town. We make them drag children from a boarding house by force. We make them show everyone exactly what they're willing to do to protect Crowell's power. Barnes, who'd stayed behind after the crowd left, shook his head slowly. You're going to get yourself killed, Hart. You know that, right? Maybe. But I'm going to do it in the light, where everyone can see. That's the difference between Crowell and me. She does her work in the dark. I'm going to make her do it in public, and let people decide what that means. They went to the courthouse at 3 o'clock, all of them together. Caleb led, with the children following and a growing crowd trailing behind. Word had spread, and it seemed like half the town wanted to see what would happen. They filled the courthouse steps, the hallway, the courtroom itself. Judge Whitmore was a heavy man in his 60s, with jowls that shook when he spoke, and eyes that never quite met yours directly. He sat behind his bench looking irritated at the disruption to his afternoon. Mr. Hart, I've already issued my ruling. This hearing is unnecessary. With respect, Your Honor, you issued a ruling without hearing testimony from the alleged victims. That's not justice. That's paperwork. The crowd murmured approval. Whitmore's face darkened. Watch your tone. I could hold you in contempt. Hold me then. But first, let these children speak. Let them tell you what happened. If their testimony doesn't warrant investigation, then arrest me and be done with it. But give them a voice. Whitmore looked past Caleb to where Crowell sat in the front row, flanked by her lawyer, a thin, sharp-faced man named Ashford. She gave the smallest nod. Very well, Whitmore said heavily. The boy may speak. 5 minutes. Then this matter is closed. Evan stepped forward. Caleb could see him trembling, could see the fear and anger warring in his young face. But his voice, when it came, was steady. My name is Evan Reed. I'm 13 years old. 2 weeks ago, I watched Margaret Crowell order my father's murder. For the next 5 minutes, he spoke. He described the spring on their land, the repeated offers to buy, his father's refusals. He described that final visit, the argument, the casual way Dutch Keller had drawn his gun. He described the sound of the shot, his father's body falling, the blood spreading across the dirt. Crowell stood over him, Evan said, his voice breaking. She told Dutch to make sure he was dead. Then she looked at me and said, "This is what happens when people don't understand how the world works." Those were her exact words. And then she took us. The courtroom was silent. Caleb looked at the faces in the crowd. Shock, horror, disbelief, but also recognition. People who'd suspected but never known. People who'd closed their eyes to avoid seeing. Whitmore cleared his throat. An emotional account, certainly, but emotion isn't evidence. Mrs. Crowell, do you wish to respond? Crowell stood, composed and dignified. Your Honor, I sympathize with these children. They've suffered a terrible loss, but grief sometimes manifests as anger, and anger seeks blame. The truth is, I was nowhere near the Reed property when Samuel died. I was in Cheyenne, meeting with territorial officials. I have receipts, witness statements, documentation of every hour of that day. She produced papers, handing them to Ashford, who passed them to the judge. As for the children being taken, I rescued them. When I returned from Cheyenne 3 days after Samuel's death and learned that these children were orphaned and alone, I took them into my home. I fed them, clothed them, and began the process of becoming their legal guardian so they wouldn't become wards of the state. You locked us in a room, Clara said loudly. You starved us. Crowell's expression didn't change. I kept them safe while I secured the proper legal documents. They were traumatized, prone to running away. I was protecting them from themselves. By stopping their food? Caleb demanded. By threatening them? I did no such thing. These are fantasies, Mr. Hart, probably encouraged by you for reasons I can't fathom. Perhaps you see an opportunity to claim their land yourself. Perhaps you're simply a troubled man looking for purpose. Either way, you're manipulating vulnerable children. The words landed like blows. Caleb could feel the crowd's mood shifting, uncertainty creeping in. Crowell was good at this, turning accusations around, creating doubt, making the victim sound unreliable. Your Honor, Ashford said smoothly, we have documentation proving Mrs. Crowell was not present at the time of death. We have the marshal's report ruling it accidental. We have properly filed guardianship papers. Against this, we have the word of traumatized children and a man with no connection to this family. The law is clear. Whitmore nodded, and Caleb saw the trap closing. This had never been about truth. It had been about process, about creating a record that would justify whatever conclusion Crowell wanted. Then let's talk about the water rights, Caleb said suddenly. The real reason Samuel Reed is dead. Crowell wanted his spring. She's been acquiring water rights across the valley for years, choking out smaller ranchers, consolidating power. Samuel's death was convenient for her, eliminated a holdout, and gave her legal access to his property through guardianship. Speculation, Ashford snapped. Wild, baseless speculation. Is it? Check the land records. Check the pattern of acquisition. Check how many accidents have happened to people who refuse to sell to Crowell. That's enough. Whitmore's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Mr. Hart, you're dancing very close to slander. I've heard enough. The children will be returned to Mrs. Crowell's custody immediately. Deputy Pike, take them into— No. Evan's voice cut through the courtroom. He moved to stand directly in front of the judge, his thin body rigid. I won't go. None of us will. You'll have to drag us out of here. Pike stood, hand moving to his club. The crowd tensed. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between the deputy and the boy. You're really going to do this? He asked quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. You're going to brutalize children in a courtroom, in front of all these witnesses? For her? Pike hesitated. His eyes flicked to Whitmore, to Crowell, back to Caleb. Around them, the townspeople watched, and Caleb could see the calculation happening in every face. This was the moment where abstract became concrete, where papers and pronouncements became actual violence against actual children. Do it, Crowell said coldly. They're my legal wards. Retrieve them. Pike moved forward. Caleb didn't retreat. Behind him, he felt the children pressing close, forming a knot of fear and defiance. Pike's hand closed on Caleb's arm, and Caleb let it happen, let himself be moved aside, because this was the point, to make them reveal themselves. Pike reached for Evan. The boy flinched but didn't run. And then Clara screamed, a sound so raw, so filled with terror that it stopped everyone. Please, she cried. Please don't take us back. She'll kill us. She said so. Once we signed the papers, she said we'd disappear, that accidents happen all the time to orphans. The crowd erupted. People surged forward, shouting questions, making protests. Whitmore hammered his gavel uselessly. Pike, overwhelmed, released Evan and stepped back. And in the chaos, Caleb saw Crowell's mask slip for just a moment, a flash of cold fury that confirmed everything. Order, Whitmore bellowed. I will have order, or I'll clear this courtroom. But order was already gone. Barnes was scribbling frantically in his notebook. Reverend Michaels was calling for mercy and investigation. Townspeople were shouting their own stories of Crowell's acquisitions, their own suspicions. The careful facade of legal propriety had shattered, and underneath was something raw and angry. Crowell stood. Your Honor, clearly this situation has become too volatile. Perhaps it would be best to table this matter for a few days until emotions have settled. It was a tactical retreat, and Caleb recognized it immediately. She was pulling back, regrouping, looking for another angle of attack. Whitmore seized on it gratefully. Yes, yes, an excellent suggestion. The matter is postponed pending further review. Mr. Hart, the children may remain in your custody temporarily, but you are not to leave town. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and with it, a temporary reprieve. Caleb ushered the children out through the crowd, feeling hands pat his shoulder, hearing voices of support. But he also caught the darker glances, the faces that showed not support, but fear of being noticed, of being associated with trouble. They made it back to the boarding house as the sun was setting. Mrs. Chen had beef stew waiting, and the children ate mechanically, exhausted by the day's emotions. Caleb stood at the window, watching the street, waiting for what came next. It came at midnight. Caleb smelled the smoke before he saw the flames. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, shouting at the children to wake up. Mrs. Chen was already in the hallway, her face pale in the lamplight. "The kitchen," she gasped. "Something in the kitchen." Caleb ran. The boarding house's rear entrance was ablaze, flames climbing the wooden walls with terrifying speed. He could see through the window, a bottle broken on the floor, liquid spreading, fire racing along it. Not an accident. Arson. "Out!" he roared. "Everyone out the front, now!" The children stumbled down the stairs, coughing in the thickening smoke. Thomas carried Anna, Clara held Lila's hand, Evan brought up the rear. Mrs. Chen grabbed blankets and her cash box. They spilled into the street as flames engulfed the back half of the building. The night erupted with bells and shouting. Townspeople formed bucket brigades, but it was too late. The boarding house burned hot and fast, the dry wood consumed in minutes. By dawn, only the front wall remained standing, smoke still curling from the ruins. "Everyone out?" the fire chief asked, his face grim. "Everyone," Mrs. Chen confirmed. She was sitting on the curb wrapped in a blanket, watching her livelihood turn to ash. "We got out. But everything else—" Caleb crouched beside her. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. Crowell did this because of us." "Crowell did this because she's evil," Mrs. Chen said flatly. "Don't apologize for her sins." Barnes arrived as the sun rose, taking notes on the scene. Witnesses saw two men on horseback leaving the alley just before the fire started. No one got a good look at their faces. "One of them had a scar," Evan said quietly. He was standing apart from the group, staring at the ruins. "I'd bet my life on it. Dutch Keller was here." "Can't prove it," Barnes said. "But I'll write it anyway. People need to see the pattern." Caleb looked around at the children, soot-stained and shivering in the winter morning. They'd lost their home, then their guardian, then their freedom, and now even temporary shelter. Everything was being stripped away, piece by piece, in a systematic attempt to isolate them, to make them vulnerable. "We need somewhere safe," Clara said. "Somewhere she can't burn down." "The church," Reverend Michaels said. He'd come with the crowd and now stepped forward. "It's stone, hard to burn. And it's sanctuary. Tradition holds that law doesn't enter sacred ground." "Tradition isn't law," Caleb pointed out. "No, but it's something. And right now, something is better than nothing." So they went to the church. It was Christmas week, and the building still held decorations from the previous Sunday's service. Pine boughs and candles, red cloth draped over the altar. They made beds in the Sunday school room, using cushions from the pews and blankets donated by parishioners. Anna slept in a cradle that had been used for the nativity scene. For 3 days they lived in the church. Supporters brought food and supplies. Children from the town came to play with Lila and Thomas, treating the whole thing like an adventure. But Caleb saw the strain in Evan's eyes, the way the boy flinched at every sound. This wasn't safety. This was a siege. On the third night, Crowell came again. Not with men and guns this time, but with economic pressure delivered through a series of messengers. Barnes received notice that his printing press lease would not be renewed. Reverend Michaels was informed that church funding from the diocese was being reconsidered. Farmers who'd spoken in support found their bank loans suddenly called due. One by one, the circle of support contracted. People who'd been vocal became silent. Doors that had been open closed. Fear proved more powerful than righteousness, and Crowell knew exactly how to wield it. "She's choking us out," Barnes said on the fourth day. He'd come to the church looking haggard. Every business that helps you, every person who speaks up, she punishes them, makes examples. People are terrified. So we're alone. Not completely. There are still people willing to stand, but they're scared. And scared people make bad allies. That night, Caleb sat in the empty church and felt the weight of his choices pressing down. He'd thought righteousness was armor, that truth was a weapon. But against money and power and fear, they seemed suddenly fragile. Evan found him there, sitting in a pew with his head in his hands. "We should go," the boy said quietly. "Run. Tonight, while we can. Head for Montana, like we planned. She'd find you. Maybe, but at least you'd be free. You've done enough, more than anyone had a right to ask." Caleb looked at him, this child who'd become older than his years, who carried responsibility no 13-year-old should bear. "You think I'd sleep easier knowing I gave up? I think you'd sleep in your own bed instead of a church pew. I think you'd have your farm back, your life." "My life was already gone, Evan. It died 7 years ago with my family. You and your sisters and brother, you gave me something back. You made me remember what it feels like to stand for something, to matter. You think I'm going to walk away from that? Even if it kills you? Especially if it kills me, because then at least I'd die meaning something." Evan was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "My father said something like that once. He said land isn't just dirt, it's what you're willing to defend. He defended ours and it got him killed. Would you rather he'd given up? I'd rather he was alive. So would I. But he made a choice, same as I'm making one. Some things are worth the cost." The boy nodded slowly, then sat down beside Caleb. They sat together in the darkness, two souls bound by circumstance and choice, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. It brought a telegram. Deputy Warren delivered it personally, his face carefully neutral. "This came for you this morning. Figured you'd want to see it right away." Caleb opened it. The message was from the territorial governor's office, brief and bureaucratic. "Your correspondence received. Matter referred to federal marshal. Investigation pending." "Investigation pending," Caleb read aloud. "That's something." "That's nothing," Warren said quietly. "Investigations take months. Crowell owns months. By the time any one official shows up, this will be over one way or another." He was right, and Caleb knew it. But the telegram was proof that their story had traveled beyond Crowell's immediate control, that somewhere, someone was paying attention. "Thank you for bringing it," Caleb said. Warren nodded, then hesitated. "Hart, she's planning something. I don't know what, but there's been meetings. Dutch and the others coming and going at strange hours. Whatever she's going to do, it's coming soon." "Why tell me?" The deputy looked away. "Because I have daughters, and I keep thinking about what I'd want someone to do if they were in danger, and I couldn't help them." He met Caleb's eyes. "I'm a coward. I won't stand with you, but at least I can give you warning." He left, and Caleb read the telegram again, looking for hope in its sparse words and finding only the thinnest thread. Investigation pending. In the meantime, they were trapped, too visible to hide, too vulnerable to defend, too far into the fight to retreat. The answer came that night in the form of hoofbeats and torches. Caleb saw them from the church tower where he'd been keeping watch. A line of mounted men approaching down the main street, flames dancing in their hands. 20 riders, maybe more. At their head rode Margaret Crowell herself, tall in her saddle, her face grim in the firelight. "They're coming," he called down. "Everyone to the sanctuary, now!" The children gathered around the altar while townspeople who'd been sheltering with them fled out the back. Only Reverend Michaels, Barnes, and Mrs. Chen remained, standing with Caleb as the riders surrounded the church. Crowell didn't dismount. She sat her horse like a queen surveying a battlefield, and her voice carried through the cold night air. "Caleb Hart, you've made your point. You've had your moment of defiance. Now it's over. Send out the children, or we'll come in and take them." Caleb stepped out onto the church steps. Behind him, he heard Evan's sharp intake of breath, Clara's stifled sob. "Under what authority?" "The authority of reality, Mr. Hart. You've lost. Your supporters have abandoned you. Your shelter has burned. The law is against you. There's nowhere left to run, nothing left to hide behind. This ends tonight. You'll have to burn down a church to get them. If necessary. No hesitation, no pretense. I've been patient. I've followed procedure. But my patience is exhausted. Those children belong to me, and I will have them. The only question is how much more needs to be destroyed before you accept that. The torches moved closer. Caleb could see faces in the crowd, Pike, Dutch, other men he recognized from town, men who'd chosen money over conscience, power over principle. There are witnesses, Barnes called out. You do this, the whole territory will know. The territory will know that I protect what's mine and punish those who interfere. That's a lesson worth teaching. Dutch Keller moved his horse forward, his scarred face twisted in something like pleasure. Enough talk. I'll go in and drag them out myself. And that's when Lila Reed stepped out of the church. She was small for her 9 years, thin and dark-haired, and she walked down those stone steps like she was approaching an altar. The torchlight caught her face, showing tear tracks, but also something else. A terrible, resolute courage. I'll tell them, she said, her child's voice cutting through the night. I'll tell everyone what happened, what you did. Crowell's horse shifted, sensing its rider's tension. Get back inside, child. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me most of all. Lila's voice grew stronger. Because you killed my father. I saw you. I was hiding under the porch when you came that day, and I saw everything. The crowd, the townspeople who'd gathered at a distance, the riders themselves, went silent. Caleb held his breath, understanding that something fundamental was shifting. I saw Dutch pull his gun, Lila continued. I heard you tell him to do it. I heard the shot, and I heard what you said after. The fantasies of a traumatized child. You said, now we can move forward with the spring acquisition. Take the bodies to the barn and make it look like an accident. Those were your words exactly. I'll never forget them. I hear them every night when I try to sleep. The last word broke on a sob, but Lila didn't retreat. She stood there, this tiny girl facing down a woman who'd killed her father, and she didn't run. That's enough, Dutch snarled. He dismounted, striding toward the steps. I'm taking them, all of them, and anyone who tries to stop me will answer to me. The voice came from the darkness beyond the torchlight. Deputy Warren stepped forward, and he wasn't alone. Behind him came others, farmers, merchants, even 2 other deputies. Not an army, but enough to matter. Enough to make the violence that was about to happen into something public, undeniable, and permanent. This ends, Warren said, his voice shaking but firm. I'm done. I'm done being part of this. Done pretending I don't see what's happening. Mrs. Crowell, you're under investigation for the murder of Samuel Reed and the illegal detention of his children. Until federal marshals arrive, you're to surrender yourself to custody. Crowell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. On what evidence? The word of a child? The word of 3 children, Clara said, joining her sister on the steps. We all saw it. We'll all testify. And we'll support their testimony, Warren said. I've been keeping records, quiet records, things I saw but didn't report, payments to judges, threats. I couldn't stop it then, but I can document it now. Thomas came out next carrying Anna, then Evan. The 5 Reed children stood together on those church steps, lined up like soldiers, facing down the woman who destroyed their lives. And Margaret Crowell finally understood that she'd lost control of the narrative. You're making a mistake, she said, but the certainty was gone from her voice. All of you. This will ruin you. We're already ruined, one of the farmers said quietly. You made sure that, at least this way, we go down fighting. The standoff stretched, torches guttered in the wind, horses stamped nervously, and Caleb, standing with the children, felt time itself holding its breath. Then Crowell made her final mistake. She nodded to Dutch, a gesture so small and so damning, and Dutch reached for his gun. He never cleared leather. Warren shot him first, a clean shot that dropped the foreman like a stone. The sound echoed off the church walls, and in its wake came chaos. Crowell's men scattered, some riding hard for the darkness, others throwing down weapons and raising hands. The woman herself sat frozen in her saddle, staring at Dutch's body as if she couldn't comprehend how the story had turned against her. Arrest her, Warren said wearily. Someone arrest her before I do something I'll regret. Pike moved forward, and this time there was no hesitation. He pulled Crowell from her horse and bound her hands while she stared at nothing, her face blank. The empire she'd built was crumbling, and she seemed unable to process it. As they led her away, she turned to look at Caleb one last time. "You've won nothing," she said. "They'll still take your farm. You'll still lose everything." "What was it worth, Hart? Playing hero for children who aren't even yours?" Caleb looked down at Evan, at Clara, at the others standing close. "Everything," he said simply. "It was worth everything." The jail cell door clanged shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire town. Margaret Crowell stood behind the iron bars, her expensive coat dusty from the struggle, her silver hair disheveled. But her eyes, those pale blue eyes that had commanded empires and crushed lives, remained sharp and calculating even in defeat. "This won't hold," she said quietly to Warren as he locked the cell. "You know it won't. By morning, lawyers will arrive, judges will remember their obligations, and you'll remember what happens to men who forget their place." Warren's hand trembled as he pocketed the key. "Maybe, but tonight, you're here, and those children are safe. That's enough for now." Outside, the crowd that had gathered at the church followed them to the jail, a tide of humanity that had finally found its courage. Caleb walked among them, the children close at his sides, and felt the strange weight of victory mixed with exhaustion. They'd survived. They'd stood. But the war wasn't over, only this battle. Barnes was already writing, his pencil flying across paper by lamplight. "This is the story," he muttered, half to himself. "This is the one that changes everything. Local children face down killer, empire crumbles. No, wait. Truth and testimony break Crowell's grip. Better, more dramatic." "Just make sure it's accurate," Caleb said. "We need truth, not drama." "Truth is dramatic enough." Barnes looked up, his weathered face alive with purpose. "Do you understand what happened tonight? People stood up. After 15 years of bowing and scraping, they finally stood up. That's the real story." But Caleb knew the real story was more complicated. He saw the faces in the crowd. Not all triumphant, not all brave. Some looked terrified of what morning would bring. Others looked calculating, already wondering how to position themselves for whatever came next. Fear didn't disappear just because one tyrant fell. It just found new shapes to wear. At the boarding house ruins, Mrs. Chen had set up a makeshift kitchen in her neighbor's yard. She was serving hot soup to anyone who came, her face set in determined practicality. When she saw Caleb and the children, she ladled out generous portions without a word, just a nod that acknowledged what they'd all been through. "Where will you stay tonight?" she asked, handing Anna's bottle to Thomas with the ease of someone who'd been watching how he cared for his baby sister. "The church, I suppose," Caleb said, "unless you know somewhere else." "My sister has rooms above the dry goods store. Not fancy, but they're warm, and they're yours as long as you need them." She paused, her voice dropping. "This isn't over, Mr. Hart. You know that." "I know." "Crowell's arrest, it's symbolic, but symbols can be broken. She has resources we haven't even seen yet, people in places we don't know about. The moment she's free—" "Then we make sure she's not free," Evan interrupted. His young face was hard in the lamplight. "We make sure the trial happens fast, before she can organize. We get testimony from everyone she's hurt. We bury her under so much truth she can't dig out." Mrs. Chen studied the boy with something like respect. "You've grown up fast, haven't you?" "I didn't have a choice." They spent that night in the rooms above the dry goods store, two cramped spaces that smelled of fabric and dried herbs. The children collapsed into sleep almost immediately, their bodies finally releasing tension that had kept them upright for days. Only Evan stayed awake, sitting by the window and watching the street below. Caleb joined him, his rifle across his lap. "You should sleep." "Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see it again. The gunshot, Dad falling, her face as she looked down at him." Evan's voice was flat, empty. "Do you think she'll actually pay for it? Or will she buy her way out like she's bought everything else?" "I don't know, but we've done everything we can to make sure justice has a chance." Justice. Evan tasted the word like it was bitter. My father believed in justice. Look where it got him. It got him children who survived, who stood up, who refused to disappear. Caleb shifted, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. Your father's death wasn't meaningless, Evan. It was murder, and murder is evil. But what you've done with it, the courage you've shown, the way you've protected your siblings, that transforms it, that gives it meaning beyond what Crowell intended. I'd rather have my father back. Of course you would. But since you can't, you honor him by being the man he raised you to be. And from what I've seen, he raised you to be someone worth knowing. Evan was quiet for a long time. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, what happens to us after, when this is over, when Crowell's convicted or freed or whatever happens, what becomes of us? Caleb hadn't let himself think that far ahead. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. We'll figure it out, he said finally, one step at a time. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. Dawn came cold and bright, the kind of winter morning where sound carried for miles and breath froze in the air. Caleb woke to the sound of horses and voices, too many of both. He moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. The street below was filled with riders, 20, maybe 30 of them, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of men who'd been paid to do violence. At their head rode a man Caleb didn't recognize, tall, dressed in a federal marshal's coat, with a badge that caught the morning light. Everyone up, Caleb said quietly. We have company. By the time they reached the street, half the town had gathered. The rider with the marshal's badge sat his horse with easy authority, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Caleb. You Caleb Hart? I am. Marshal Thaddeus Kane, out of Cheyenne. I'm here about a woman named Margaret Crowell. Understand you've got her locked up on some serious charges. Relief flooded through Caleb. The telegram had worked. Help had arrived. That's right, Marshal. These children witnessed her murder their father. She held them prisoner, tried to force them to sign over their land rights. Last night, her foreman tried to kill them, and she ordered it. Kane nodded slowly, his face unreadable. That's quite a story. I'll need to hear it in detail. Where's the woman now? In the jail. Deputy Warren arrested her last night after an armed confrontation that resulted in the death of her foreman. Kane's voice was neutral, but something in his tone made Caleb's relief falter. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Crowell first. Standard procedure, gotta hear both sides before making any determinations. Marshal, with respect, there's only one side to murder. These children saw it happen. And I'll hear their testimony in due course, but first, I need to understand the situation from all angles. Kane dismounted, his men following suit. Deputy Warren around? Warren emerged from the crowd looking exhausted. He hadn't slept, had spent the night guarding the jail and writing out his statement. Marshal Kane, I sent the request for investigation. Glad you're here. Let's talk inside. Kane gestured toward the marshal's office, and Warren led the way. Caleb moved to follow, but Kane held up a hand. Just the deputy for now. I'll call for you when I'm ready. The door closed, leaving Caleb and the children standing in the street with the crowd and Kane's men. Barnes appeared at Caleb's elbow, his expression troubled. Something's wrong, the editor muttered. Federal marshals don't usually travel with private armies. Those aren't marshals. Look at them. Look at their gear. Those are hired guns, Hart, the kind you see guarding payroll wagons and escorting prisoners worth stealing. Why would a marshal need that kind of backup for a simple investigation? The answer came an hour later when Kane emerged from the office, with Warren trailing behind, his face ashen. The marshal's expression was grave as he addressed the crowd that had swelled to include most of the town. Ladies and gentlemen, I've conducted a preliminary investigation into the matter of Margaret Crowell. I've reviewed Deputy Warren's statement, examined the evidence provided, and spoken with Mrs. Crowell herself. He paused, and Caleb felt dread building in his chest. Based on what I've learned, I'm releasing Mrs. Crowell from custody pending a full territorial hearing. The crowd erupted. Shouts of protest, anger, disbelief. Caleb stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. What about the children's testimony? He finally managed. What about the murder? The children's testimony is noted and will be considered, but there are significant inconsistencies, and Mrs. Crowell has provided documentation that contradicts key elements of their claims. Kane's voice was firm, brooking no argument. The death of Samuel Reed has already been investigated and ruled accidental by local law enforcement. Without new physical evidence, I can't override that ruling based solely on testimony from traumatized minors. New evidence? Barnes pushed forward. What about the pattern of acquisitions? The intimidation? Is not evidence of murder, sir. It may be evidence of aggressive business practices, but that's a civil matter, not criminal. Kane looked directly at Caleb. Mr. Hart, I understand you've developed an attachment to these children, but they have a legal guardian, properly appointed and documented. Your interference, however well-intentioned, is actually creating more trauma for them. The kindest thing you could do is let them return to Mrs. Crowell's care while the courts sort out the inheritance questions. Return to her care? Claire's voice rang out, high and desperate. She'll kill us. She told Evan she would. She said, Young lady, Kane said, not unkindly, I know you're frightened, but making wild accusations helps no one. Mrs. Crowell has assured me that you'll be well cared for, that your concerns will be addressed, and that any misunderstandings will be resolved through proper legal channels. The jail door opened, and Margaret Crowell emerged. Someone had brought her fresh clothes, had allowed her to fix her hair and compose herself. She looked every inch the dignified matron, the benevolent guardian wrongfully accused. Her eyes found Caleb across the crowd, and in them he saw triumph. Thank you, Marshal Kane, she said, her voice carrying. I'm grateful that cooler heads have prevailed. This has been a terrible ordeal for everyone, especially the children. I bear Mr. Hart no ill will. He acted out of misguided compassion. But now it's time for these young ones to come home where they belong. She extended her hand toward the children, and Caleb felt them press against his back, felt their fear like a physical thing. No, Lila said, her voice shaking but clear. We won't go. We'll run again. We'll keep running forever, but we won't go back to her. Kane's expression hardened. Miss, I'm trying to be patient, but if you refuse to comply with legal guardianship orders, I'll have no choice but to remove you by force, for your own protection. Protection from what? Evan demanded. From the woman who murdered our father? Some protection. That's enough. Kane's hand moved to his hip, where a leather case held what Caleb assumed were restraints or worse. Mrs. Crowell, if you'd like to collect your wards... Wait. The voice came from the back of the crowd. An old man pushed forward, leaning heavily on a cane. Caleb recognized him. Jeremiah Stone, one of the oldest residents of White River, a rancher who'd been here since before the territory was organized. Marshal, before you do something you can't undo, maybe you ought to hear what I have to say. Kane looked annoyed. Sir, unless you have direct evidence related to... I have testimony about how Samuel Reed really died. See, I was there. Not at the Reed place, but close enough. I was checking my fence line that runs along their northern border, and I heard the shot. One shot, clear as day. Rifles don't go off accidentally just once, Marshal. They either discharge multiple times as someone fumbles with them, or they fire once because someone pulled the trigger deliberately. Kroll's composure flickered. The Marshal has already ruled, I'm not finished. Stone's voice was thin but steady. I also saw riders leaving the Reed property maybe 10 minutes after that shot. 2 riders on horseback moving fast. One was a woman. I could tell by the silhouette even at that distance. The other was a man with something distinctive about his face, though I couldn't make out what at that range. This is speculation, Kroll said sharply. Hearsay and assumption. It's eyewitness testimony, Barnes countered, which is exactly what you claim the children's statements were. Kane looked between them, his certainty wavering for the first time. Mr. Stone, why didn't you come forward with this information before? The old man's face hardened. Because I'm not a fool, Marshal. I've seen what happens to people who cross Margaret Crowell. My ranch is small, my family's grown and gone, and I figured keeping my mouth shut was the price of keeping my land. But after last night, after watching those children stand up to her, he shook his head. I'm 83 years old. I don't have many years left to be ashamed of my cowardice, so I'm speaking now. I saw riders leaving the Reed place right after Samuel died, and I'm willing to swear to it in any court you want. The crowd murmured, and Caleb saw the calculation happening in Kane's eyes. This was no longer a simple matter of children's testimony versus legal documents. This was an independent witness, someone with no apparent connection to either side, corroborating the murder claim. "Marshal," Crowell said, her voice tight. "This man is clearly being influenced by his conscience," Stone interrupted. "Something you wouldn't recognize." "That's enough," Kane said, but his tone had changed. "Mr. Stone, I'll need you to make a formal statement. Mrs. Crowell, you'll need to remain available for questioning while I investigate this new information." "Am I being detained?" "You're being asked to cooperate with a federal investigation. If you refuse, then yes, I'll have no choice but to—" "She'll do more than refuse." Another voice, this one female and rough with age. A woman stepped forward, her face weathered by sun and hardship. "She'll lie, and she'll buy her way out, just like she always does. But maybe it'll be harder this time because I've got records." Caleb didn't recognize her, but Crowell clearly did. The color drained from the older woman's face. "Sarah," Crowell said, and for the first time her voice held something like fear. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 5 years ago when you forced my husband to sell his land for half its value, and then he drank himself to death out of shame." Sarah held up a leather satchel. "He kept records, Margaret. Every threat you made, every price you manipulated, every dirty dealing. He documented it all, thinking maybe someday someone would care. He died thinking he was a coward. But I won't." She thrust the satchel at Kane. "It's all in there. Names, dates, amounts. Bribes paid to Judge Whitmore. Payments to deputies for looking the other way. The engineer you hired to divert water from the southern ranches. Everything." Kane took the satchel slowly, his expression unreadable. He opened it and began leafing through papers, his face growing darker with each page. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing that the balance had shifted again. "These documents," Kane said carefully, "if authentic, suggest a pattern of criminal activity far beyond a single murder. We're talking fraud, bribery, conspiracy, abuse of office. We're talking about lies," Crowell snapped, her composure finally cracking. "This is a coordinated attack by people who envy my success. That girl's husband was a drunk who couldn't manage his own affairs. Those children are traumatized and suggestible. That old man is senile. And you, Marshall, are being manipulated by people who want to tear down everything I've built." "Everything you've stolen," Warren said quietly. He'd been silent since emerging from the marshal's office, but now he stepped forward. "I've been keeping my own records, Marshal. Not as detailed as Sarah's, but enough to show patterns. Enough to show that nothing about Crowell's empire is legitimate." "This is absurd." Crowell looked around at the crowd, at the faces that were no longer friendly or fearful, but coldly judgmental. "You're all turning on me based on conjecture and bitter complaints. Where's the actual evidence? Where's the proof?" "You want proof?" Thomas's small voice somehow carried through the tension. The 7-year-old stepped forward, holding something in his hand, a crumpled piece of paper. "When we were locked in that room, Evan made me memorize a paper we saw on the desk outside. He said it might be important. It had numbers and names and said something about final transfer upon signature of heirs." He handed the paper to Kane. It was covered in a child's careful handwriting, transcribed from memory. Kane read it, his jaw tightening. "This appears to be a draft property transfer document. It indicates that upon the signatures of the Reed heirs, ownership of their land, including water rights, would pass to Margaret Crowell. The date is 3 days after Samuel Reed's death." He looked up at Crowell. "Care to explain why you'd have such a document prepared before you were even appointed guardian?" "I was being proactive," Crowell said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "Ensuring that the children's interests would be protected. Or ensuring you'd get what you wanted before anyone could question the circumstances of Reed's death." Kane closed the satchel. "Mrs. Crowell, based on new testimony and evidence, I'm placing you under arrest pending full investigation. The charges include murder, conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and illegal detention." "You can't do this." Crowell's voice rose. "I have connections. I have lawyers. You have the right to remain silent," Kane said flatly. "I suggest you exercise it." 2 of his men moved forward to restrain her, and this time, when she looked at the crowd, she found no sympathy. The people of White River watched in silence as Margaret Crowell, the woman who'd dominated their lives for 15 years, was led away in chains. But Caleb felt no triumph. He'd seen too much, been through too much, to believe this was an ending. He looked at Kane and saw something in the marshal's face that confirmed his suspicion. "There's more, isn't there?" Caleb asked quietly as the crowd began to disperse. "This isn't over." Kane studied him. "Smart man. No, it's not over. Crowell's arrest will trigger a response. She has allies we haven't identified, resources we haven't found. Arresting her just forced them into the open. The next few days are going to be dangerous. More dangerous than what we've already survived? Different dangerous. Before she was working in the shadows, trying to make you disappear quietly. Now she's exposed, which makes her desperate. And desperate people with power are the most dangerous kind." That night, Caleb and the children stayed in the rooms above the dry goods store under guard. Kane posted 2 of his men outside, professional gunmen who watched the street with the alertness of wolves. Inside, the children tried to process what had happened. "Is it really over?" Clara asked. She was sitting with Anna in her lap, rocking the baby who'd finally started to put on weight, whose eyes tracked movement, and whose cries were healthy and demanding. "Can we actually be safe now?" "It's progress," Caleb said carefully. "But Kane is right. We need to stay alert." Evan stood at the window, his silhouette dark against the lamplight. "She'll try something. Even from jail, she'll find a way to hurt us. Let her try. She's just one woman now, not an empire. Just a woman who'll face justice." But justice, Caleb was learning, was a complicated thing. Over the next 3 days, as Kane conducted his investigation and the town buzzed with revelations from Sarah's documents, the full scope of Crowell's corruption emerged. Judge Whitmore had been accepting payments for favorable rulings. The bank president had been approving loans based on Crowell's instructions. Even the previous marshal had been on her payroll. The institutions that were supposed to protect people had been rotted from within. Fixing them would take more than arresting one woman. It would require rebuilding trust, reestablishing justice, creating new systems that couldn't be so easily corrupted. On the 4th day, Kane called Caleb to the marshal's office. The federal man looked tired, his eyes red-rimmed from reading documents and taking statements. "We've got enough to convict her 10 times over," he said without preamble. "The murder charge alone, 3 independent witnesses now, counting young Thomas's testimony about the document and Lila's account of what she saw from under the porch. That's enough for any jury." "So it's over?" "The legal case is solid, but there's something you need to know." Kane pulled out a telegraph form. "This came this morning from the territorial prison. A man named James Ashford, Crowell's lawyer, was found dead in his hotel room last night. Poisoned. They think he was about to testify against her, provide details of bribes and kickbacks in exchange for clemency." Caleb felt cold spread through his chest. Someone killed him to keep him quiet. That's the theory. Which means Crowell has people working for her we haven't identified, people willing to commit murder to protect her secrets. Kane leaned forward. "Hart, I'm assigning permanent protection to you and the children. 2 men, rotating shifts, until this is fully resolved." "How long will that take?" "The trial's scheduled for next month. We're expediting it because of the risk to the children. If we can get a conviction, if we can seize her assets and dismantle her network, then you might actually be safe." "And if we can't?" Kane didn't answer, which was answer enough. That night, as snow fell thick and silent outside the window, Caleb sat with the children and tried to explain what was happening. They listened with the attention of people who'd learned that survival depended on understanding danger. "So we just wait?" Evan asked when Caleb finished. "Wait for a trial while people around us die?" "We wait and we prepare. We document everything, give testimony, make sure the truth is so well established that even if something happens to us, it survives." "If something happens to us?" Clara repeated softly. "You mean if we're killed?" Caleb wanted to lie, to offer reassurance, but these children had earned honesty through their own courage. "Yes, that's what I mean. But Kane's men are good, and we're not helpless. We're aware, we're careful, and we're not alone anymore." Lila, who'd been quiet through most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "I'm not scared anymore. I was scared when we were running, when we didn't know if anyone would help us. But now I know people can be good, that they can stand up. Even if something bad happens, I'm not scared the same way." Thomas nodded gravely, his small face serious. "We're together. That's what matters." Anna, oblivious to the danger, gurgled happily in Claire's arms. She was thriving now, growing stronger every day, a living symbol of resilience and hope. The next 2 weeks passed in strange tension, daily life continuing while everyone waited for something to break. Caleb visited his farm once, escorted by Cain's men, and found it exactly as he'd left it. Nothing burned, nothing stolen, just empty and waiting. Why didn't she destroy it, he wondered aloud. One of the guards, a man named Peterson, answered. Destroying property creates evidence, raises questions. Crowell worked in the shadows. She made things look natural, legal. Burning your farm would have been too obvious. The trial date approached. Witnesses were prepared. Evidence was organized. Barnes wrote daily articles documenting each new revelation about Crowell's crimes. The territory watched as White River became the center of a drama about power, justice, and the question of whether ordinary people could truly hold the powerful accountable. 3 days before the trial, Lila woke screaming. Caleb burst into the children's room to find her sitting up in bed, her face pale in the moonlight. Clara was already beside her, arms wrapped around her younger sister. "What happened?" "I remembered something," Lila gasped. "Something I forgot. Or maybe I just couldn't think about it until now." "Tell me." "There was a fourth person there. When Dad was killed, I saw 3 people, Crowell, Dutch, and someone else standing back by the barn. I couldn't see their face, but they were watching. They were part of it." Evan was awake now, too. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "I don't know. My brain just blocked it out, I guess. But tonight I dreamed about that day, and it was so clear. There was definitely someone else there. Could you identify them if you saw them again?" "Maybe. They were wearing a hat pulled low, and they stayed in shadow, but their build, their stance, if I saw it again, I might recognize it." Caleb reported this to Cain the next morning. The marshal added it to the growing file of evidence, but his expression was troubled. "A fourth person we haven't identified, someone who witnessed the murder and helped cover it up. Someone who's still free and might be anywhere." He looked at Caleb. "Double the guard. No one gets close to those children without being checked." The precautions proved necessary. That afternoon, a man approached the dry goods store claiming to be a reporter from Denver. He had credentials, identification. Everything seemed legitimate. But when Peterson asked him about specific Denver landmarks, the man's answers were vague. When pressed, he ran. "They're probing our defenses," Cain said when he heard. "Testing for weaknesses. The trial's in 2 days. They're running out of time to stop it." The next night, someone tried to poison the water supply at the boarding house where several witnesses were staying. They were caught by one of Cain's men. A teenager paid $5 to slip powder into the well. When questioned, he claimed a stranger had hired him but couldn't provide a description beyond "wore a hat, spoke quiet." The fourth person, the ghost in Crowell's network, still working, still trying to derail justice. On the morning of the trial, White River woke to find guards posted every 20 feet along the route from the jail to the courthouse. Cain had brought in additional federal marshals, and the territorial governor himself had sent a representative to observe. This was no longer just about one murder. It had become a test of whether law could function in the frontier territories. The courtroom filled early. People stood in the aisles and crowded the windows. Barnes had his notebook ready. Mrs. Chen sat with a group of women who'd lost husbands or sons to Crowell's greed. Jeremiah Stone was there, his old face set in grim determination. Sarah clutched her dead husband's documents. And in the front row, Caleb sat with 5 children who were about to testify against the woman who'd destroyed their family. Margaret Crowell entered in chains, her face composed but her eyes burning with cold fury. She looked at each of them in turn, the children, the witnesses, the crowd, and Caleb saw her making calculations, counting remaining options. Judge Whitmore was not presiding. He'd recused himself after his bribery was exposed, and a circuit judge named Henderson had been brought in from Montana. Henderson was known for being incorruptible, which was exactly why he'd been chosen. "This court is now in session," Henderson announced. We're here to determine the truth regarding the death of Samuel Reed and subsequent criminal acts. Let's proceed with opening statements. The territorial prosecutor stood, a young man named Williams who'd volunteered for the case when more senior attorneys refused. His voice shook slightly as he began, but it grew stronger with each word. Your Honor, the territory will prove that Margaret Crowell, motivated by greed and thwarted in legitimate business dealings, orchestrated the murder of Samuel Reed on November 15th of this year. We will demonstrate through eyewitness testimony, documentary evidence, and established pattern of behavior that Mrs. Buss Crowell systematically eliminated anyone who opposed her acquisition of land and water rights. Samuel Reed was not her first victim, but with your permission, he will be her last. Crowell's attorney, a replacement brought in from Cheyenne, offered a defense of confusion, misunderstanding, and malicious prosecution. But his heart wasn't in it. Everyone could see that the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony began. Jeremiah Stone described the gunshot and the riders. Sarah presented her documents, explaining each bribe and threat in careful detail. Warren outlined the pattern of intimidation. Barnes testified about articles he'd been pressured not to write, stories he'd been threatened for covering. And then it was the children's turn. Evan went first. He walked to the witness stand with his back straight, his young face composed. He placed his hand on the Bible, though Caleb noted the irony of swearing truth on a holy book in a territory where truth had been for sale, and began his testimony. My name is Evan Reed. I'm 13 years old. On November 15th, I watched Margaret Crowell order the murder of my father. For the next hour, he spoke. He detailed every moment of that terrible day. His father's refusal to sell, Crowell's arrival with Dutch Keller, the argument, the gun, the shot, his father's body on the ground. She looked at him, Evan said, his voice steady despite tears streaming down his face. She looked at my father bleeding in the dirt, and she said, "Some people never learn that everything has a price." Then she saw me watching from the window, and she smiled. She smiled like she'd won something. The courtroom was silent. Even Crowell's attorney had no cross-examination that could challenge the raw honesty in Evan's voice. Clara testified next about their imprisonment, Thomas about the documents he'd memorized. And finally, Lila took the stand. She was so small that her feet didn't touch the ground when she sat in the witness chair. But when she spoke, her voice filled the courtroom. I was under the porch, she said. I'd been playing there earlier, making a fort. When Crowell came, I hid because her voice scared me. I saw everything through the gap between the boards. I saw Dutch pull his gun. I saw my father fall. I heard Crowell say, "Take care of this, make it look natural, and find those children. They're worth more to us alive than dead until they sign the papers." She paused, her small hands gripping the rail in front of her. And I saw the fourth person, the one standing by the barn. The courtroom erupted. Henderson gavelled for order, his voice sharp. "Miss Reed, are you saying there was another individual present?" "Yes, sir. I couldn't see their face, but they were there. They watched the whole thing and didn't stop it. That makes them guilty, too, doesn't it?" "It certainly does." "Can you describe this person?" Lila closed her eyes, remembering. Tall, taller than Dutch, but not as broad, wearing dark clothes and a hat pulled low. They stood very still, like they were used to watching and not being seen. And their left hand, she frowned. Their left hand was wrapped in something, cloth maybe, or bandages. Henderson made notes. "Anything else?" "Just the way they stood, patient, like they'd wait as long as it took. When it was over, when Crowell told Dutch to clean up, that person nodded once and walked away toward the tree line. I didn't see where they went after that." Kane, sitting behind the prosecutor, was already writing urgently. Caleb saw him pass a note to Williams, who nodded and stood. "Your Honor, based on this new information, the territory requests a short recess to investigate the identity of this fourth individual." Henderson agreed, and they broke for lunch. But Caleb barely tasted his food. He kept thinking about what Lila had described. Someone patient, someone used to watching, someone with a bandaged left hand. The realization hit him as he was walking back to the courthouse. "Warren," he said, grabbing the deputy's arm. "Your hand. What happened to it?" Warren looked confused. "What? Nothing. Just burned it on a stove last week. Why? Let me see. Warren held up his left hand, showing a clean bandage wrapped around his palm. It's healing fine. Why does this... He stopped as understanding dawned on his face. You think I'm the fourth person? Hart, I was the one who arrested Crowell. I testified against her. I know, I don't think it's you, but someone with a hand injury was there. Someone who might still be working for Crowell. They brought this to Kane, who immediately began checking alibis and whereabouts of everyone connected to the case. It took 2 hours, but finally a pattern emerged. Pike, the deputy who'd served Crowell's orders and tried to take the children by force, had reported sick on November 15th. He'd claimed a hand injury from breaking up a bar fight, but there was no record of any such fight. Where's Pike now? Kane demanded. He left town 3 days ago, Warren said slowly. Said he was visiting family in Laramie. He's supposed to be back for the trial. Get a description out on the wire. I want him found and brought back. If he's the fourth person, he's a witness to murder at minimum, possibly an accomplice. But Pike was already gone. A telegraph came back within the hour. He'd never arrived in Laramie. His family hadn't heard from him. He'd simply vanished. When the trial resumed, this new information was presented. Crowell's face remained impassive, but Caleb saw the flash of fear in her eyes. Her last ally had abandoned her, and his absence was as damning as any testimony. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict in a voice that shook the courtroom. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On charges of conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and illegal detention, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. The courtroom exploded with sound, cheers, sobs, shouts. Henderson gavelled for order, his face stern as he addressed Crowell. Margaret Crowell, you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very foundation of civilized society. You used wealth and influence to corrupt institutions meant to protect the innocent. You murdered a man for his land and terrorized his children. You represent everything wrong with unchecked power. I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. Sentence to be carried out 1 week from today. May you find mercy in the next world, since you showed none in this one. Crowell stood to hear her sentence, and for the first time her composure shattered completely. She looked at the children, at Evan, at Clara, at little Lila who'd remembered her presence, and her face twisted with something beyond rage or fear. It was the expression of someone who'd believed themselves untouchable, discovering they were only human after all. This isn't justice, she said, her voice cracking. This is revenge dressed up in robes. Those children lied. That evidence was fabricated. You're all fools being manipulated by... Remove her, Henderson ordered, and the marshals led her away, still screaming, still cursing, still unable to accept that her empire had fallen and she with it. In the chaos that followed, Caleb found himself surrounded by well-wishers and grateful townspeople. But his attention was on the children. They stood together in the corner of the courtroom, and for the first time since he'd found them in his barn that frozen Christmas Eve, they looked at peace. Justice had been served. The truth had broken through years of corruption and fear. Margaret Crowell would hang, and with her, the system she'd built would be dismantled. But as Caleb watched them, these 5 souls who'd survived murder, imprisonment, and persecution, he knew the real work was only beginning. They'd won their freedom. Now they had to figure out how to live with it. The week between conviction and execution stretched like a wound that wouldn't close. White River existed in a strange liminal space where justice had been declared but not yet delivered, where victory felt incomplete and fragile. Caleb watched the children struggle with this new reality. They'd won, but winning felt less triumphant than they'd imagined. Evan spent hours staring out windows, his young face carved with thoughts too heavy for his years. Clara became obsessively protective of Anna, barely letting the baby out of her sight. Thomas had nightmares that left him gasping and crying in the dark. And Lila, who'd been so brave on the witness stand, now flinched at sudden movements and refused to be alone. They need time, Mrs. Chen said, as she brought breakfast to the rooms above the dry goods store on the 3rd morning. They've been running on fear and adrenaline for weeks. Now that the danger's past, their bodies and minds are catching up to what they've been through. Is the danger really past? Caleb asked quietly. He was standing at the window watching the street below where Kane's men still maintained their watch. Crowell's in jail, but Pike's still out there, and whoever else might have been part of her network. You can't live your whole life waiting for the next attack. At some point, you have to choose to believe it's over and start rebuilding. But choosing to believe proved harder than surviving. That afternoon, a lawyer named Hutchins arrived from Cheyenne with documents requiring the children's attention. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the apologetic manner of someone delivering bad news wrapped in legal language. "Mr. Hart, children, I'm here representing the territorial court regarding the estate of Samuel Reed and the disposition of Margaret Crowell's seized assets." He spread papers across the table. "There are several matters that require immediate attention and decision." Evan, who'd been appointed temporary representative for his siblings until he reached majority, sat down heavily. "What matters?" "First, the Reed property. Your father's land, including the spring and water rights, is legally yours. However, there are outstanding debts, mortgage payments, taxes, operational costs that have accumulated during the incident. The total comes to approximately $800. The number hung in the air like a stone. Caleb saw Evan's face go pale. "We don't have $800. We don't have $8. "I understand. Which brings us to option 2. The bank has expressed willingness to foreclose on the property and settle the debts, leaving you with a small cash payment, perhaps $200 to split among the 5 of you." "So we lose our father's land anyway," Clara said bitterly. "Everything he died protecting we just handed over to a bank?" Hutchins shifted uncomfortably. "There is a third option. Several parties have expressed interest in purchasing the property outright. The offers range from $1,000 to $1,500, which would clear all debts and leave you with capital to start fresh elsewhere." "Who's making these offers?" Caleb asked sharply. "Various businessmen and ranchers. All legitimate, I assure you. Though I should mention that Mrs. Crowell's estate, once her execution is carried out and her appeals exhausted, will be liquidated. Her assets include substantial cash, multiple properties, and," he consulted his papers, "water rights to 17 separate sources across the territory." "Water rights she stole," Evan said flatly. "Water rights that, once legally processed, will be returned to their rightful owners or sold at public auction. The proceeds will go toward restitution for her victims." Hutchins looked at the children with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "You're entitled to claim damages as victims of her crimes. The amount would likely be substantial, perhaps enough to clear your debts and maintain your property." "How long would that take?" "Months? Possibly a year or more. The legal complexities are significant, and there are many claimants. In the meantime, your debts continue to accumulate." Caleb watched the hope drain from Evan's face as the boy understood the trap. They'd won justice in court, but the machinery of law and finance moved at its own pace, indifferent to the urgency of children who needed shelter and food and certainty. "What if someone paid the debts now?" Caleb heard himself say. "Kept the property solvent until the restitution comes through?" Everyone turned to look at him. Hutchins adjusted his spectacles. "That would certainly solve the immediate problem. Do you have such resources, Mr. Hart?" Caleb thought about his own farm, his savings, the modest stake he'd built through years of careful management and solitary living. $800 was most of what he had. It would leave him vulnerable, dependent on a good harvest to rebuild his reserves. "I might," he said carefully, "if the children agree to certain conditions." Evan's eyes narrowed. "What conditions?" "That I'm appointed legal guardian until you reach majority. That decisions about the property are made jointly, and that when the restitution comes through, the money goes into a trust for all 5 of you. Education, futures, whatever you need." "Why would you do this?" Clara asked. The suspicion in her voice cut Caleb, but he understood it. They'd been betrayed by someone claiming guardianship before. "Because your father died defending something that mattered. Because you've all fought too hard to lose it now to banks and lawyers. And because—" He paused, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "Because somewhere in all this, you stopped being strangers I was helping. You became people I care about. Family, maybe, if you'll have me." The silence stretched. Anna made a small sound in Clara's arms, and the normalcy of it, a baby needing attention, seemed to break the tension. Family isn't just caring, Evan said slowly. It's staying. It's being there even when it's hard. Can you promise that? Caleb met the boy's eyes and saw the fear underneath the question. Fear of abandonment, of being left again, of trusting someone who might disappear. He thought about his own years of isolation, the walls he'd built around his grief, the safety of emotional distance. I can promise I'll try, he said honestly. I can't promise I'll be perfect or that I won't make mistakes, but I can promise I won't walk away, not from you, not from this. Whatever comes, we face it together. Evan looked at his siblings, at Clara holding Anna, at Thomas leaning against his older brother, at Lila watching with those two old eyes. Something passed between them, a silent communication born of shared trauma and survival. Okay, Evan said finally. Okay, we accept. You pay the debts, we keep the land, and you're our guardian, but this is our decision too, not just yours. Absolutely, Caleb agreed. Major decisions get discussed, all of us together. Hutchins began preparing the paperwork, relieved to have a solution that didn't involve foreclosure or forced sales. As he worked, Caleb felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settling onto his shoulders. He'd gone from a solitary farmer to the guardian of 5 children, from a man trying to survive to a man responsible for shaping 5 futures. That evening, as they prepared to move back to Caleb's farm, their farm now, he supposed, Barnes arrived with the latest edition of his newspaper. The headline read, "Crowell execution scheduled. Era of corruption ends." "Thought you'd want to see this before it hits the streets," Barnes said, handing Caleb a copy. "I wrote a follow-up about the children and their testimony, about how courage from unexpected places can change everything. I hope that's all right." Evan took the paper and read silently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he handed it back. "It's fine. Just don't make us into heroes. We're not. We just survived." "Surviving when the world's against you is its own kind of heroism," Barnes said gently. "But I understand. I'll keep the focus on the facts, not the mythology." After he left, they packed what little they had. Clothes donated by townspeople, a few toys for the younger children, Anna's basket. Mrs. Chen pressed food into their hands and promised to visit once they were settled. Reverend Michaels offered a blessing that Caleb politely declined, not from disrespect, but from a sense that whatever protected them wasn't words spoken in churches, but choices made in moments of crisis. The ride back to Caleb's farm took them through countryside transformed by recent snow. Everything was white and clean, as if the land itself had been wiped fresh. The children were quiet, each lost in private thoughts, until they crested the ridge and saw the farmhouse below. It looked smaller than Caleb remembered, more weathered. 7 years of living alone had made him forget how a house appeared through other eyes. The sagging porch rail he'd meant to fix, the paint peeling on the northern wall, the barn door that hung crooked on its hinges. "It needs work," he admitted as they pulled up. "A lot of work, but it's solid. Your father and I built that barn together when we were younger. The house has good bones." "You knew our father?" Thomas asked, surprised. Caleb nodded slowly, the memory surfacing. "Long time ago, before you were born. We worked on a crew together building a bridge across the northern creek. He was a good man, honest, hardworking. We lost touch after that job ended, but I always respected him." "He never mentioned you," Evan said, but without accusation, just stating fact. "No reason he would. We weren't close, just 2 men who once worked side by side. But I remember him, and I remember thinking the territory needed more men like Samuel Reed, men who stood for something." They unloaded in silence as the sun set, painting the snow pink and gold. Inside, the house was cold, and Caleb started fires in both stoves, while the children explored rooms that would now be their home. He heard their footsteps overhead, their quiet conversations, the sound of Anna's laughter as Clara made faces at her. This was what life sounded like, he realized. Not the silence of grief, but the noise of people living together, occupying space, filling emptiness with presence. That night, he cooked the first real meal they'd shared in his house, venison stew with vegetables, bread still warm from Mrs. Chen's oven, apple pie she'd insisted they take. They ate at the table that had seen only Caleb's solitary meals for 7 years, and the difference was profound. Food tasted better when shared. Warmth felt deeper when surrounded by others. Even the simple act of passing the salt became meaningful. "Tomorrow," Caleb said as they finished eating, "we'll need to make plans. The farm needs winterizing, the animals need tending. We'll need to discuss schooling for you 3 older ones, and—" "Can we just have tonight first?" Clara interrupted softly. "Can we just sit here and be safe for one night before we start planning everything else?" Caleb looked at her, at all of them, and saw the exhaustion that ran deeper than bodies, deeper than fear. They needed rest not just from danger, but from constant vigilance, from always thinking 3 moves ahead. "Of course," he said. "Tonight we rest. Tomorrow we plan." They stayed at the table long after the meal ended, talking about nothing important: favorite foods, funny stories, memories of times before everything went wrong. Lila described the creek on their old property where she'd caught her first fish. Thomas talked about a dog they'd once had named Rusty. Clara remembered her mother's singing voice. Evan spoke haltingly about his father's laugh, how it sounded like thunder rolling across summer fields. Caleb shared his own memories of Mary's terrible cooking when they first married, how she'd burned soup and he'd eaten it anyway. Of Samuel learning to walk, stumbling around the yard chasing chickens. Small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but which now constituted his entire treasure of family. When the candles burned low and Anna fell asleep in Clara's arms, they moved upstairs to the rooms Caleb had hastily prepared. The boys would share Samuel's old room, the girls would take what had been Mary's sewing room, and Anna would sleep in a cradle Caleb had pulled from the attic, the same cradle that had once held his son. As he helped Thomas make up his bed, the boy looked at him seriously. "Mr. Hart, are you sad that we're here? In your son's room, I mean. Does it hurt?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Caleb had to pause before answering. "It did hurt," he said finally, "when I first brought you here that Christmas Eve. But now it feels right. Like the room was waiting for children who needed it. Samuel would have liked that, I think. He was generous, even as a little boy, always sharing his toys, his food. He would have wanted his room to help someone." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "I'll take good care of it. And maybe sometimes, if it's okay, you could tell us stories about him, so we know who lived here before us?" "I'd like that," Caleb said, surprised by how true it was. For 7 years he'd refused to speak of Samuel, as if silence could preserve his memory in amber. But maybe sharing those stories, letting them live in other minds and hearts, was a better preservation. Sleep came easier that night than it had in weeks. Caleb lay in his own bed listening to the house settle around him, hearing the breathing of 5 children who'd somehow become his responsibility and his purpose. Outside, the wind howled and snow fell, but inside was warmth and safety, and something that felt like the beginning of healing. The next morning brought practical reality crashing back. Caleb woke to find his water pump frozen, 3 chickens dead from the cold, and Duchess, his mare, favoring her left front leg. The farm had suffered from his absence, and rebuilding would require work and money and time he wasn't sure he had. Evan found him in the barn, examining Duchess's hoof by lantern light. "Is she all right?" "Bruised, probably from ice in the paddock. She'll heal, but she needs rest." Caleb straightened, his back protesting. "Your father's property. When was the last time anyone checked on it?" "Not since we ran. Why?" "Because 2 weeks of winter with no one tending things means frozen pipes, dead livestock, damage. We should ride over today, assess what needs doing." They saddled 2 horses. Duchess wasn't fit, so Caleb borrowed a gelding from his neighbor and set out after breakfast, leaving Clara in charge of the younger children. The Reed property was 5 miles north, and the ride gave them time to talk without the others listening. "You didn't have to do this," Evan said as they followed the snow-covered road. "Take us in, pay our debts. You could have just testified and walked away." "Could have. Didn't want to." "Why not?" Caleb watched his breath fog in the cold air. "You asked me that before. I gave you an answer about duty and doing what's right. But the truth is more complicated. When Mary and Samuel died, I thought my life was over. Not in the sense that I wanted to die, but in the sense that the part of me that connected to other people, that cared about anything beyond survival. That part went dormant. For 7 years, I went through motions. I worked, I ate, I slept, but I didn't live. Not really. And then we showed up in your barn. And then you showed up. 5 strangers who needed help, and something in me woke up. At first, I told myself it was just temporary, just until you were safe. But the more time I spent with you, the more I remembered what it felt like to matter to someone, to have a reason to get up beyond habit. You gave me that back. Evan was quiet for a long moment. My dad used to say that people save each other, that it's never just one person helping another. It always goes both ways. I didn't understand what he meant until now. They rode in companionable silence after that, and when they reached the Reed property, both stopped on the ridge to take it in. The house stood abandoned, windows dark, snow piled against the door. The barn's door swung loose in the wind. Fences had broken under snow weight, and the spring that Samuel Reed had died protecting bubbled up from frozen ground, water flowing free despite the ice that tried to claim it. "It's worse than I thought," Evan said quietly. "It's fixable," Caleb countered. "Nothing here that work and time can't repair. The spring's still good. That's what matters most." They spent the morning assessing damage and making lists. 3 goats were dead, frozen in the barn. The chickens had escaped through a broken board and were scattered or dead. The house's pipes had burst in 2 places, but the structure was sound, the well was clear, and the spring ran pure and strong. "This water," Caleb said, kneeling beside the spring and letting the icy flow run over his fingers. "This is what your father died for, not just the physical resource, but what it represented. Independence, the ability to sustain yourself without bowing to anyone else's control." Crowell understood that whoever controls water controls life. Your father wouldn't let her have that power. Was it worth dying for? That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you this. Because of his choice, because he refused to surrender, 5 children learned what it means to stand for something. That lesson might be worth more than all the water in Wyoming. They worked until afternoon, then rode back as the sun sank toward the horizon. At Caleb's farm, they found the yard transformed. Clara had marshaled Thomas and Lila into clearing snow from the paths. Someone had fixed the broken step on the porch. Smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney, and through the window, Caleb could see Anna in her basket, batting at a string of dried flowers Clara had hung above her. "They've made it home," Evan observed. "So have we," Caleb replied. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Mornings began with chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs, chopping wood. Caleb taught the children the skills their father would have: how to read weather, how to mend fences, how to treat sick livestock. Evan proved a quick study, his hands already calloused from helping his father. Clara had a gift for cooking, transforming basic ingredients into meals that warmed more than just bodies. Even Thomas and Lila contributed, their small hands suited for delicate work like sorting seeds and mending tack. In the afternoons, Caleb insisted on schooling. He wasn't educated formally himself, but he could read and write and cipher, and he worked through borrowed textbooks with the older children while the younger ones learned their letters. Education was survival, he told them. Not just reading and arithmetic, but learning to think, to question, to understand the world beyond their immediate experience. "Why do we need to know history?" Thomas complained one afternoon, struggling with a passage about the Revolutionary War. "It already happened. How does knowing it help us now?" "Because history shows you patterns," Caleb explained. "It shows you how people with power try to keep it, and how people without power can challenge it. Everything that happened with Crowell, the corruption, the intimidation, the belief she was untouchable, that's happened before in different times and places. Understanding history means you recognize those patterns when you see them starting again." Valentine Michaels visited weekly, bringing news from town and checking on their well-being. Margaret Crowell's execution had been carried out on schedule, he reported. She'd gone to the gallows cursing everyone who'd testified against her, refusing to admit guilt even at the end. Her estate was being liquidated, and the process of returning stolen property and water rights had begun. "There's talk of naming the spring after your father," Michaels told Evan during one visit. "Reed Spring, as a memorial to his resistance. Some families whose water Crowell stole want to create a collective, shared resources, mutual protection. They're calling it the Reed Agreement, after Samuel's refusal to be intimidated. Evan's face showed complicated emotions. They're turning him into a symbol. Is that bad? I don't know. It feels like they're taking him away from us somehow, making him into something public when he was just our dad. Caleb understood that feeling. When Mary and Samuel died, people had offered condolences that felt like they were claiming ownership of his grief, turning private loss into public performance. But he'd also learned that sometimes letting others share in memory could ease its weight. Your father was your dad first, he told Evan. That doesn't change no matter what others do. But if his stand can inspire others to resist corruption, to protect what matters, maybe that's another kind of legacy. Not replacing your memories, just adding to them. March brought the thaw, and with it, news from Cheyenne. The territorial governor's office sent notice that the Reed children's restitution claim had been approved. Crowell's liquidated estate would provide each child with approximately $3,000, more than enough to pay off all debts, restore their property, and establish trust funds for their futures. Hutchins delivered the news personally, spreading documents across Caleb's kitchen table. "This is extraordinary," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Most restitution cases take years and result in pennies on the dollar. But the governor's office made this a priority, probably because of public attention. You children are quite famous, you know. The story of your testimony has spread across multiple territories." "We didn't do it to be famous," Clara said quietly. "We did it because it was true." "The best kind of fame," Hutchins agreed. "Fame earned through courage rather than sought through vanity. Now, regarding the funds, I recommend establishing individual trusts for each of you, with Mr. Hart as trustee until you reach majority. The principal remains untouched, but the interest can be used for education, health needs, and other necessities." They signed papers, made decisions, planned futures. With the debts cleared, the Reed property became truly theirs again, and they began discussing how to restore it while maintaining Caleb's farm. The solution came from an unexpected source: Jeremiah Stone, the old rancher who'd testified about the gunshot. "I'm getting too old for my spread," he told them when he visited in April. "My children have moved east, and I'm rattling around in a house too big for one person. What if I moved into the Reed place, kept it running, and we worked both properties together? I get a home and purpose, you get experienced help, and 3 properties supporting each other." It was a good plan, and they agreed quickly. Stone moved his few possessions to the Reed house and began repairs with the enthusiasm of someone given new purpose. The 3 properties, Caleb's farm, the Reed ranch, and Stone's former spread, formed a triangle that could share resources, labor, and protection. As spring turned to summer, something remarkable happened. Other families, inspired by the children's courage and the collapse of Crowell's empire, began reaching out. Some had lost land they wanted to reclaim. Others had been intimidated into silence and now wanted to speak. Deputy Warren, who'd found his courage on that night outside the church, worked to document crimes Crowell had committed and identify assets that should be returned. White River transformed from a town ruled by fear into a community rediscovering its own strength. The newspaper Barnes ran became a forum for truth-telling, where people could share their stories without intimidation. The church Reverend Michaels led became a gathering place for organizing mutual aid and resistance to any future would-be tyrants. And at the center of it all, in memory if not in presence, were 5 children who'd refused to disappear. But the children themselves were focused on smaller, more immediate concerns. Thomas learned to ride well enough to help with cattle. Lila discovered a talent for healing, apprenticing herself informally to the town doctor. Clara's cooking evolved from survival to artistry. And Evan, who'd carried the weight of protecting his siblings through unimaginable hardship, began slowly to let that weight lighten. One evening in July, Caleb found him sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The boy, nearly 14 now, and shooting up like a weed, was whittling a piece of wood with a knife his father had once owned. "What are you making?" Caleb asked, settling into the chair beside him. "I don't know yet. I'm just cutting away the parts that don't belong and seeing what's left." Evan's knife moved with practiced ease. "Dad taught me that. He said carving is like life. You start with more than you need and spend your time figuring out what's essential." "Wise man, your father." "Yeah." Evan's hand stilled. "I used to think about revenge, about finding Pike, making him pay. about whether Crowell's death was enough justice or if there should have been more suffering. But lately I've been thinking maybe the best revenge is this. This? Living, building something good. Taking what she tried to destroy and making it stronger. She wanted us dead or broken or disappeared. Instead, we're here, we're healing, and we're creating something she could never have. Actual community built on trust instead of fear. He resumed whittling. That feels like the kind of revenge that matters. Caleb watched the sun paint the sky orange and gold, listened to the sounds of Clara singing to Anna inside, heard Thomas and Lila arguing good-naturedly about something trivial. This was life reasserting itself after trauma, messy, loud, imperfect, but undeniably alive. Your father would be proud of you, he said, all of you. You survived something that should have broken you, and instead you're thriving. We had help. You helped us. We helped each other. That's what family does. The word hung in the air between them, family. Not the family they'd lost, but the family they'd chosen and built from necessity and proximity and shared survival. It wasn't traditional, wasn't what either of them had imagined, but it was real and strong and worth protecting. In August, the territorial court finalized Caleb's guardianship, making official what had been functional for months. Judge Henderson, who'd presided over Crowell's trial, came personally to deliver the papers and observe the situation. I confess I was skeptical at first, he told Caleb privately. A bachelor farmer taking on 5 orphans. It seemed like a recipe for disaster. But what you've built here, what these children have become under your care, it's extraordinary. They're not just surviving, they're flourishing. I can't take credit for that. They were already extraordinary. I just gave them space to be. You gave them more than space. You gave them safety, stability, and, if you'll forgive the observation, a model of what it means to stand for something even when it costs you. Henderson signed the final documents. Guardianship is granted through Evan's 18th birthday, at which point he becomes legal guardian of his siblings unless other arrangements are made. The court will check in annually, but I don't anticipate problems. You've proven yourself more than capable. After Henderson left, Caleb gathered the children to explain what the guardianship meant legally. But before he could start, Evan spoke up. We know what it means. It means you're officially stuck with us. The boy's attempt at levity couldn't quite hide the deeper emotion underneath. Thank you for everything, for not turning us away that first night, for fighting for us, for making us family when we thought we'd never have one again. You're welcome, Caleb said, his throat tight. But you need to understand something. This arrangement, it's not just me taking care of you. It's mutual. You've given me back something I thought was gone forever. Purpose, connection, a reason to keep going beyond just survival. So don't thank me like I'm doing you a favor. We're doing each other a favor. We're saving each other. That night they celebrated with a dinner that had become tradition. Everyone contributing something, the table overflowing with food and laughter. Anna, now over a year old, sat in a high chair Caleb had built and smeared mashed potatoes everywhere while Thomas tried unsuccessfully to teach her to use a spoon. Lila told stories about the patients she'd helped the doctor treat. Clara described a new recipe she wanted to try. Evan discussed plans for expanding the cattle operation. Normal conversation, family conversation, the kind of mundane joy that had seemed impossible 6 months earlier. As Caleb watched them, his children now, in every way that mattered, he thought about choice and consequence. One choice made on a frozen Christmas Eve had cascaded into hundreds of other choices, each one shaping and being shaped by what came before. He could have turned them away, could have called the marshal that first night, could have decided at any point that the cost was too high, but he hadn't. And in not turning away and choosing again and again to stand with them, he'd been transformed as much as they had. The empty house had become a home. The silent man had rediscovered his voice. The survivor had learned to live again. Outside, summer stars filled the sky, and somewhere in town, other families were sharing meals, telling stories, building lives. White River was healing, slowly but surely, from years of corruption and fear. The Reed children's courage had catalyzed that healing, but it was the daily choice of ordinary people to be better, to do better, that would sustain it. And here, in this farmhouse that had known grief and silence, life continued its patient work of transformation. Not erasing what had been lost, that could never be erased, but building something new alongside it, honoring the dead by living fully, remembering trauma by refusing to be defined by it, moving forward not by forgetting the past, but by refusing to let it have the final word. Justice had been served in a courtroom, but it was being lived out here in the dailiness of survival and connection, in children learning and growing, in a man rediscovering what it meant to love and be loved, in a community choosing courage over comfort. Margaret Crowell was dead, her empire dismantled, her crimes exposed and punished. But her victims were alive, and they were building something she'd never understood and could never have created, a future based not on power and control, but on mutual care and shared humanity. That was the truest justice, not just punishment for wrongdoing, but the refusal to let wrongdoing determine what came next. The insistence that love and community and connection could survive even the worst that people could do to each other. As the evening deepened and the children began preparing for bed, Caleb stood on his porch, looking out at land that had been his alone for 7 years, but was now shared, communal, alive with possibility. The farm would continue. The children would grow. Time would pass and bring its inevitable changes and challenges. But tonight, this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. 5 children safe and healing. 1 man no longer alone. A community rediscovering its strength. A future opening like a flower after winter. Choice had brought them here. Choice would carry them forward. And in the space between what was lost and what was being built, something precious and irreplaceable had taken root and was growing toward light. The years that followed moved like a river, sometimes rushing, sometimes slow, but always forward, always carrying them toward something they couldn't quite see until they arrived. Caleb watched the children grow with the wonder of someone who'd been given an unexpected second chance at fatherhood, each stage bringing new challenges and unexpected joys. Evan turned 15, then 16, his shoulders broadening and his voice deepening into something that reminded Caleb painfully of Samuel Reed. The boy had his father's steady character, that same quiet determination that had gotten him killed but had also saved his children. But Evan also carried shadows that sometimes darkened his eyes when he thought no one was watching, memories that didn't fade just because justice had been served. One October evening, 2 years after Crowell's execution, Caleb found Evan in the barn sitting on a hay bale with his father's old rifle across his knees. The boy wasn't cleaning it or doing anything purposeful, just holding it like a talisman against something invisible. "You all right?" Caleb asked, settling onto a nearby bale. "I saw him today, Pike. At least I think I did." Evan's voice was flat, carefully controlled. "I was in town getting supplies, and there was a man watching from across the street. Tall, same build, and when he saw me looking, he turned away fast and disappeared into the crowd." Caleb felt cold settle into his chest. Pike had never been found, had vanished completely after the trial. Warren and Kane had searched for months, following leads that went nowhere, checking every town and settlement within 200 miles. Eventually, the manhunt had been called off, the assumption being that Pike had fled to California or Mexico or simply died somewhere remote and unmourned. "You sure it was him?" "No?" "That's what makes it worse. I'm not sure of anything except that I felt watched, and it reminded me of how I felt when we were running, when we knew Crowell's men were hunting us. That feeling that danger is always just behind you, waiting." Evan's hands tightened on the rifle. "I thought after the trial, after she was executed, I'd stop feeling this way. But I don't. I still check shadows. I still plan escape routes. I still wake up at night convinced someone's coming for us." "That's normal, Evan. After what you went through, is it normal? Or is it damage? Am I going to carry this fear forever, jump at shadows until I'm old?" The boy's voice cracked. "I want to be normal. I want to think about normal things like whether the south field needs rotating or if Clara's sweet on the banker's son. But instead, I'm sitting here with a gun, watching for ghosts." Caleb understood that kind of haunting. He'd carried his own ghosts for 7 years before the Reed children arrived, and in some ways, he still did. Mary's face in certain light, Samuel's laugh in a child's voice. The weight of loss that never quite lifted just became familiar enough to carry. "I can't tell you the fear goes away completely," he said carefully, "but I can tell you it changes. It becomes part of you instead of all of you. You learn to live alongside it rather than being controlled by it. And having people around you who understand, that helps more than anything. What if Pike really is back? What if he's planning something? Then we deal with it, together. Not like before when you were alone and desperate. Now you have me, you have your siblings, you have a whole town that stood with you. Pike is just one man, and he's the one who should be afraid. He's wanted for murder conspiracy. Any lawman who spots him will arrest him on sight. Evan nodded slowly, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. I'll tell Warren tomorrow about maybe seeing him, at least get it on record. Good idea. But Evan? Caleb waited until the boy met his eyes. Don't let fear of what might happen steal the life you're actually living. That's giving Crowell and Pike a victory they don't deserve. You survived. Now you need to do more than survive. You need to live. The boy considered this, then carefully returned the rifle to its place on the wall. How do you do that? How do you choose to live instead of just survive? Small things. You notice beauty. You find joy where you can. You make plans for next year instead of just next week. You let yourself care about people even though caring means risk. Caleb stood, stretching his aging back. You let Clara be sweet on the banker's son without warning her about all the ways love can hurt. You help Thomas with his arithmetic even though it's frustrating. You read to Lila even when you're tired. You make Anna laugh because her laughter matters more than your fear. That's how you live. Over the following weeks, Warren investigated Evan's sighting but found nothing concrete. Either it hadn't been Pike or the man had moved on quickly. But the incident served as a reminder that some wounds never fully healed, some fears never fully released their grip. The best you could do was refuse to let them run your life. Clara turned 17 that winter, beautiful in a way that made Caleb simultaneously proud and terrified. She'd inherited her mother's grace and her father's integrity, and boys from 3 counties away had started finding reasons to visit the Hart farm. She handled their attention with amused tolerance, but Caleb had noticed the way she looked at Daniel Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew who'd moved to White River to help with her dry goods business. You going to talk to her? Mrs. Chen asked Caleb one afternoon when he'd come to town for supplies. About Daniel? Talk to her about what? I'm not blind. I see how they look at each other. So you approve? It's not about my approval. She's 17, old enough to know her own mind. And Daniel seems like a good young man, respectful, hardworking, kind to his family. What more could I want? Mrs. Chen smiled. You've become wise in your old age, Caleb Hart. Most men would be chasing suitors away with shotguns, but you trust her judgment. I trust who she's become. And if I've learned anything from raising these children, it's that controlling them doesn't protect them. Teaching them to think clearly, to value themselves, to recognize good character, that protects them. The rest is their choice to make. But when Daniel formally asked permission to court Clara that spring, Caleb still felt his chest tighten. This was one of the moments that marked time's passage irrevocably. Children becoming adults, families expanding to include new people. The careful structures you'd built shifting to accommodate growth and change. I'll treat her with respect, Daniel said earnestly, standing in Caleb's kitchen with his hat in his hands. I know she's been through a lot, and I won't push her or rush her. I'd like the chance to know her better, with your blessing. Caleb studied the young man, 22, steady employment, good reputation, genuinely nervous in a way that suggested he understood the weight of what he was asking. You know her story, what she survived? I know some of it. What's public knowledge? She doesn't talk much about the details, and I respect that. Those details matter, Daniel. They shaped her. She's stronger than most people twice her age, but she also carries scars. You court her, you need to understand you're courting someone who's survived trauma. That requires patience and understanding most young men don't have. I'm willing to learn, sir, and I'm not afraid of scars. We've all got them. Hers are just more visible than most. Something in that answer satisfied Caleb. He extended his hand. You have my blessing. But Daniel, you hurt her, and you'll answer to me and 4 siblings who've already survived one person trying to destroy them. They won't hesitate to destroy you right back. Daniel's grip was firm. Understood, sir. I wouldn't expect anything less. Clara's romance unfolded through spring and summer with the sweet awkwardness of first love. Walks by the creek, shared meals, Earnest conversations on the porch while Caleb pretended not to eavesdrop. Watching her happiness, Caleb felt both joy and melancholy. Joy because she deserved this, deserved normalcy and romance and all the simple pleasures trauma had tried to steal. Melancholy because it marked the beginning of her moving toward her own life, away from the tight unit they'd formed in survival. "You're not losing her," Evan said one evening, reading Caleb's mood with the perception he'd developed from years of watching for danger. "She's just expanding. We all are. That's how it's supposed to work." "I know. Doesn't make it easier." "Nothing about this has been easy. But look at us. We're here. We're whole. We're building lives. That's more than anyone expected when we showed up in your barn half dead from cold and fear. Whatever comes next, we can handle it." That confidence was tested sooner than expected. In September, Thomas came down with a fever that wouldn't break. Lila, who'd been studying with the town doctor, recognized symptoms that made her face go pale. Scarlet fever, the same disease that had killed Caleb's first wife and son. "We need to quarantine him," she said with an authority that seemed too large for her 14 years. "Keep Anna away especially. She's most vulnerable. I'll need clean water, cool cloths, and we'll have to watch for complications." For 3 days, Thomas burned with fever while Lila and Clara took turns nursing him. Caleb sat with the boy through the worst nights, remembering another child's fevered body, another battle against disease that had ended in loss. The parallel was almost too much to bear, history repeating with unbearable precision. "Don't you die on me," Caleb whispered to Thomas on the third night, when the boy's breathing turned shallow and his skin blazed with heat. "Don't you dare. Your father died protecting you. Your siblings fought hell itself to keep you safe. You don't get to give up now." Thomas's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Tired," he whispered. "So tired." "I know, but you have to fight. You have to stay." Caleb gripped the small hand, feeling how fragile it was, how easily life could slip away. "There's so much ahead for you, so much you haven't seen or done. You don't know who you'll become yet. Don't leave before you find out." Whether the words penetrated the fever, or whether Thomas's constitution was simply stronger than Samuel's had been, the fever broke before dawn. The boy woke weak and soaked with sweat, but lucid, asking for water in a voice that was thin but unmistakably alive. "You stayed," he said to Caleb, who'd slept in the chair beside the bed. "Of course I stayed. That's what family does." "Like you stayed with us from the beginning. You always stay." Thomas's eyes drifted closed again, but this time in healing sleep rather than fever delirium. Lila appeared in the doorway, checking her patient with professional detachment that couldn't quite hide her relief. "Fever's broken. He'll need careful monitoring for the next week, but he should make a full recovery." "You did that," Caleb said. "You saved him." "We saved him. You, me, Clara, even Evan keeping Anna away and managing the farm. That's what family does, right? We save each other." The echo of his own words to Thomas struck Caleb deeply. This was what they'd built. Not just a household, but a real family, bound by shared experience and mutual care. They'd taken the worst that the world offered and transformed it into something resilient and beautiful. Thomas's recovery took weeks, during which the household adjusted its rhythms to accommodate his needs. Anna, now nearly 2, didn't understand why she couldn't see her brother and cried at his door. Evan doubled his workload to compensate for Caleb's time nursing. Clara postponed outings with Daniel to help with cooking and cleaning. Everyone sacrificed without complaint because that's what you did when someone you loved needed you. By October, Thomas was strong enough to return to his chores, though Caleb insisted on limiting his hours. "You pushed too hard before, and that's probably what made you susceptible to sickness. Listen to your body. Rest when you're tired. There's no virtue in working yourself into the ground. But the farm will survive whether you milk the cows today or tomorrow. You won't survive if you don't take care of yourself." That winter, Caleb turned 60. The children threw him a surprise party that wasn't very surprising. They were terrible at keeping secrets, but was deeply moving nonetheless. They'd invited half the town, and Caleb's small farmhouse overflowed with people who'd become friends, neighbors, family, in the broader sense. Barnes was there with his latest newspaper. Mrs. Chen brought enough food to feed an army. Reverend Michaels offered a secular toast that made everyone laugh. Even Judge Henderson made the trip from Helena to attend. "Never thought I'd see this," Jeremiah Stone said, raising his glass in salute. He was 86 now, moving slower but still sharp. Caleb Hart, the hermit of Wyoming, surrounded by people who love him. The children did that, cracked you open and let the world back in. "They saved my life," Caleb said simply, "in every way that matters." As the party wound down and guests departed into the cold night, Caleb stood on his porch and looked at the farm that had been his prison and was now his kingdom. The barn where he'd found 5 freezing children, the fields he'd worked alone for years and now shared with Evan and Stone, the house that had echoed with silence and now rang with voices and laughter and all the messy noise of living. Clara found him there, wrapped in her winter coat. "Daniel asked me to marry him." The words hung in the cold air. Caleb had known this was coming, but knowing didn't make the moment less significant. "What did you say?" "I said I needed to talk to you first. Not for permission. I'm old enough to make my own choice. But because your opinion matters to me. You're my father in every way that counts, and I wanted you to hear it from me before anyone else." Father. She'd never called him that before. Had always used his name or no title at all. The word hit him harder than expected, opening something in his chest that had been locked since Mary and Samuel died. "Do you love him?" "I do. He's kind and patient, and he makes me laugh. He knows about my nightmares and doesn't ask me to pretend they don't exist. He wants to build a life with me, have children, grow old together. All the normal things I thought I'd never have." "Then you have my blessing." "My wholehearted blessing." Caleb pulled her into a hug. "You deserve every happiness, Clara. You've earned it 1,000 times over." She held him tight, and he felt her tears against his shoulder. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if something goes wrong? What if I lose him like I lost Dad? How do you let yourself love someone when you know how much it can hurt?" "You love them anyway. Because the alternative, living in fear, closing yourself off, that's not really living at all. Your father loved your mother knowing death could take her. I loved Mary knowing the same thing, and when we lost them, yes, it destroyed us. But neither of us would have chosen not to love them. The love was worth the risk." Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes. "You really believe that?" "I do. And I believe your father would want you to be happy, to take chances, to live fully. Don't let what happened to him stop you from building your own life." The wedding took place the following June, a simple ceremony in Reverend Michael's church with most of White River in attendance. Clara wore a dress sewn by Mrs. Chen from fabric her mother had chosen before she died. Something old made new, connecting past to present. Daniel wore his best suit and looked at Clara like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. Evan walked her down the aisle, and Caleb watched from the front row with Thomas, Lila, and Anna beside him. It should have been Samuel Reed giving his daughter away, but Samuel was 7 years dead, and Evan had become the man of his family through necessity and trauma. The boy, 17 now, nearly a man himself, performed the duty with dignity that would have made his father proud. At the reception, as Clara and Daniel danced their first dance as husband and wife, Lila leaned against Caleb's shoulder. "Do you think we'll all be okay? Long term, I mean. Do people like us? People who've been through what we've been through? Do we get happy endings?" "I think we get to define what happy means for us. It might not look like other people's happiness. It might include scars and shadows and moments where the past crashes in. But yes, I believe you'll all be okay. More than okay. I believe you'll thrive. Because of you. Because you took us in. Because of all of us. Because we chose each other and keep choosing each other every day." The years continued their patient work. Anna grew from toddler to child, with no memory of that Christmas Eve when she'd nearly died in Caleb's barn. To her, Caleb had always been grandfather. She couldn't remember a time before him, before this family, before this life. Her innocence was a gift to them all, proof that trauma didn't have to be inherited, that new beginnings were possible. Evan turned 18 and officially became guardian of his siblings, though in practice nothing changed. They were all bound together by something stronger than legal documents. When Evan decided to attend agricultural college in Laramie, they managed the separation with letters and visits, and when he returned with new techniques for crop rotation and animal husbandry, the farms benefited from his education. Thomas found his calling in numbers, apprenticing with the territory's land surveyor and developing a reputation for precision and honesty. Lila became the town's unofficial physician when old Doc Henderson finally retired, her gentle manner and hard-won wisdom making her beloved by patients. Even Anna, as she grew, showed signs of artistic talent that Clara and Daniel nurtured with paints and drawing paper. Clara and Daniel's first child, a boy they named Samuel, was born 3 years after their wedding. Caleb held his namesake grandson and felt time complete a circle he'd thought was broken forever. This child carried the name forward, honoring the dead while fully inhabiting the present. "Your great-grandfather would have loved you," Caleb whispered to the sleeping infant. "He was brave and stubborn and believed in standing for what mattered. Grow up to be like him, but grow up safe. That's all any of us want for you, to inherit the best parts of the past without having to survive what we did." The territorial newspapers stopped writing about the Reed children as years passed and other stories claimed attention. But in White River and the surrounding valley, their story became foundational. The story parents told children about courage and justice. The story people referenced when facing their own smaller battles against corruption or intimidation. The Reed Agreement still governed water rights, ensuring that no single person could accumulate the power Crowell had wielded. Jeremiah Stone died peacefully in his sleep at 89, leaving his property to the Reed children in his will. "They gave me purpose when I'd given up," his letter explained. "They reminded me what it meant to stand for something. This land should go to people who understand its value beyond money." Deputy Warren, who'd found his courage on that night outside the church, eventually became Marshal of White River when the previous marshal retired. He ran a clean office, refusing bribes and standing firm against anyone who tried to use intimidation or violence to get their way. "I learned from the Reed children," he told anyone who asked about his philosophy. "I learned that standing up might cost you, but standing silent costs you more." Margaret Crewell's estate was never fully liquidated. Some assets were too entangled in legitimate business to separate cleanly. But the bulk of her wealth went to restitution and public works. A school was built with her money, and a hospital, and a system of communal wells that ensured no one could be held hostage by water scarcity. Her name faded from respectful mention and became instead a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when power corrupted absolutely. Pike was never found, and eventually even Evan stopped jumping at shadows. Either he'd died somewhere remote, or he'd fled far enough away that he was no longer a threat. The Reed children learned to live with that uncertainty, accepting that some questions never got answered, some threats never got resolved. Life wasn't a story with neat endings. It was messy and ongoing and full of loose threads. On Caleb's 65th birthday, 5 years after Clara's wedding, the children gathered at his farm for what had become annual tradition, a dinner where everyone contributed food and stories, and the whole valley was invited. Over 200 people came, testimony to how deeply the hearts had woven themselves into their community's fabric. Evan, now 23 and engaged to a rancher's daughter, gave a toast that made everyone reach for handkerchiefs. 15 years ago, we stumbled into this man's barn, half dead from cold and fear. He could have turned us away. He could have done the minimum, fed us, sent us to authorities, washed his hands of us. Instead, he fought for us. He sacrificed for us. He became our father when we'd lost ours. Everything we are, everything we've become, it started with his choice on Christmas Eve to bring us in from the cold. So this toast is to Caleb Hart, who saved 5 children, and in doing so, saved himself. To family, chosen and cherished. To standing when it's easier to walk away. To love that transforms. To him. To him, the crowd echoed, glasses raised. Caleb stood awkwardly, uncomfortable with attention but deeply moved. "I don't deserve this," he said. "What I did, taking you in, fighting for you, it wasn't noble or heroic. It was selfish. You saved me from a half-life I was living, from years of just going through motions. You gave me back purpose and connection and love I thought I'd lost forever. So thank you. Thank you for stumbling into my barn. Thank you for letting me be part of your family. Thank you for transforming my ending into a new beginning." That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Caleb walked up the hill behind his farm to where Mary and Samuel were buried under the cottonwood. He'd neglected these graves for years, unable to bear visiting them. But the Reed children had changed that too. They'd cleaned the site, planted flowers, made it a place of peace rather than pain. "I hope you don't mind," he said to the headstones, feeling slightly foolish talking to the dead, but doing it anyway. "I hope you don't mind that I found another family, that I let myself love again. I never forgot you. You're part of me always. But I also couldn't stay frozen in that moment of losing you. Life kept going, and these children needed me, and I needed them. I think you'd like them. I think Samuel would have played with Thomas and Anna. I think you would have loved Clara's wedding, Mary. I think you'd be proud of what we've built here." The wind moved through the cottonwood, and in its sound, Caleb heard neither approval nor condemnation, just the patient whisper of time moving forward, carrying everything with it. He was 68 when the heart troubles started. Not dramatic, just a gradual weakening, a sense that his body was finally calling in debts accumulated through years of hard living. The doctor advised rest, lighter duties, acceptance of limitations. The children hovered, worried, trying to take on more of his work. "I'm not dead yet," Caleb protested when Evan tried to keep him from morning chores. "I can still feed chickens and mend tack. Don't turn me into an invalid before I'm actually invalid." But he knew, and they knew, that time was catching up. He'd lived a full life, 70 years by the time his heart finally gave serious warning. He'd loved and lost and loved again. He'd raised children who weren't his blood but were his heart. He'd seen justice served and community built. What more could a man ask? On a warm September evening, surrounded by all 5 of his children and their growing families, Caleb suffered his final heart attack. It wasn't dramatic or painful, just a gradual fading, like a candle burning down to nothing. His last coherent words were to Evan, who held his hand as the others gathered close. Tell everyone that I died grateful. Tell them family isn't blood. It's choice. It's staying. It's fighting for each other. Tell them I regret nothing." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, it seemed to him that Mary was there, and Samuel, both of them smiling, both of them welcoming him home. Whether it was truth or fevered imagination, it brought him peace as he slipped away from the life he'd built and the people he loved. They buried him on the hill beside Mary and Samuel, and over 300 people came to pay respects. The valley remembered him not as Caleb Hart the hermit, but as Caleb Hart who'd stood when standing mattered, who'd chosen love over isolation, who'd proved that family could be built rather than just inherited. At the funeral, Evan spoke for all his siblings. "This man wasn't our father by birth, but he was our father by choice, by sacrifice, by love that asked nothing in return. He saved us when we were children, and he shaped us as we grew. Everything good in us, our courage, our integrity, our capacity to stand for what matters, we learned from watching him. He taught us that one person choosing to act can change everything. That goodness isn't weakness. That family isn't defined by blood, but by who stays, who fights, who never lets go. We'll miss him every day for the rest of our lives, but we'll also carry him forward in how we live, in how we love, and how we choose to stand when the world demands we sit down." The years that followed showed the lasting impact of that choice made on Christmas Eve so long ago. The Reed children continued to thrive, building lives that honored both their birth father's courage and their adopted father's love. Clara and Daniel had 4 children who grew up knowing their family's history, the trauma, the survival, the transformation. Thomas became territorial surveyor, ensuring land rights were recorded honestly and disputes settled fairly. Lila trained 3 new doctors, passing on both medical knowledge and the compassion she'd learned through suffering. Anna became a renowned artist whose paintings of Wyoming landscapes captured something essential about resilience and beauty coexisting. And Evan, who'd borne the weight of protecting his siblings through their darkest hours, became a different kind of protector. He ran for territorial legislature and won, using his position to advocate for orphans and reform guardianship laws so no one like Crowell could ever again exploit vulnerable children. He married, had children of his own, and named his first son Caleb Samuel, honoring both fathers, both sacrifices, both loves. The Reed Spring continued to flow, its water shared according to the agreement Samuel had died protecting. The farms prospered under collective management, proving that cooperation could triumph over individual greed. And White River transformed from a town ruled by fear into a community known across the territory for its integrity and mutual support. Decades after that frozen Christmas Eve, after all the original players had passed into memory, people still told the story, not as history exactly, but as living example. When someone faced corruption, they remembered the Reed children's testimony. When someone felt powerless, they remembered Caleb Hart standing against an empire. When someone wondered if individual choice mattered, they remembered that one man's decision to open his barn door had cascaded across generations. The story became foundation, became myth, became the answer to that eternal question: what can one person do against overwhelming power? The answer the Valley knew was simple: stand, fight, choose love over safety, refuse to let evil have the last word. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you discover that standing alone becomes standing together, that your choice inspires others, that what seems like an ending is actually a beginning, and that family, real family, isn't something you're born into, but something you build with courage and choice and love that refuses to surrender. The wind still moves through the cottonwood on the hill where three graves rest side by side. The spring still flows pure and cold. The valley still remembers. And in the lives of those who came after, in the choices they make and the stands they take, the legacy continues. One choice. One Christmas Eve. 5 children and one broken man. From that moment, everything changed. Not just for them, but for everyone they touched. And everyone those people touched, ripples spreading outward through time like rings from a stone dropped in still water. That's what family really means. Not blood or law or obligation, but the choice to love, to stand, to stay. The choice to let your heart break open instead of closed. The choice to believe that even in the darkest winter, even when all seems lost, there's still warmth to be found in connection, still light to be found in courage, still hope to be found in the simple act of opening your door to someone who needs shelter. The Reed children learned that truth from 2 fathers, one who died protecting them, one who lived loving them, and they carried it forward into a future neither father lived to see but both had helped create. In the end, that's the only immortality that matters. Not living forever yourself, but creating something, love, community, justice, family, that survives you and grows beyond you and proves that your life, however humble, however brief, mattered in ways that echo long after you're gone.